house does not hurry. It warms adobe one shade at a time, loosens frost from fence rails, and invites mules to comment on the morning with soft, practical music. Christopher Houston Carson wakes in that half-light which belongs to rivermen and hunters. He rolls his blanket with a thrift that makes room for miles. A tin cup answers the fire with a small ringing that sounds like yes. He is short, spare, and built for usefulness, where Davy Crockett was a room loud, generous. Certain Kid is a trail quiet, precise, going where it needs to and no farther. He learned young. Apprenticed to a saddle maker until the bench felt too narrow for a boy who kept hearing a far road. Knocked politely at his ribs. He slipped west in the company of traders, who spoke Spanish like they deep been practicing with the sun for years. Bensford taught him commerce, Taos taught him courtesy, and the mountains taught him the grammar of weather. Beaver made the early 1830s a kind of currency you harvested from cold water. Carson learned sets and sign, how a bank writes in willow where a lodge might be hidden. How snow tells the stories, one about the last hour, one about the next. The fraternity of mountain men is a quiet democracy held together by cold coffee, and the understanding that luck favors the prepared. Names like Bridger and Fitzpatrick moved. Through camps like constellations, you navigated by them without needing to touch. Kid brought a particular gift, not bravado, not decoration, but attention. He listened the way a mule listens when a trail is narrow. He noticed where a brook hesitates and why. He could smell a storm in a wordless way and shorten a day or lengthen it accordingly. Language is part of attention. Carson traded syllables as carefully as he traded goods. Ute for respect, Apache for distance, Navajo for plain talk when plain talk was the most polite option, Spanish with the soft endings of northern New Mexico, English reduced to the essentials a camp needs to get through. Wintering in a beaver country teaches a man to be small. You make a fire that does not show off. You place your bed where wind forgets it for a while. You cook what the day allows and thank it without arguing. There were fights, of course. The West has sharp edges even when handled with care. But the older Kid grew, the more he avoided noise that did not move the miles forward. Rendezvous was the festival in this austere church, a meadow along a river where the year-as harvest of pelts became piles of iron and lead and coffee and cloth. Stories traded freely, some more true than others. All of them booster shots for men about to return to places where words were rarer than meat. Young hands watched Kid the way colts watch old geldings, not for show, but for how to be. He taught without trying, keep your powder honest, keep your mouth modest, keep your friends within the reach of your voice at night. He learned also the etiquette of passing through other people's countries. Fires set where fires were welcome, trails chosen to avoid insult. Trade offered before talk ran dry. He could eat with Comanche a day and with a Missouri merchant the next without making either table. Feel like a mistake if Crockett handed us a story about courage with a fatal flourish. Carson begins handing us a story about competence whispered between animals and maps. He married into the land first, a union that winter could not keep. Then a Tulsa home where Chili and Rosary shared a table with rifles that stood in the corner. Like polite uncles, domesticity for Kid was not retirement. It was reverence. It kept his feet gentle between journeys, and gave his silences a place to sit. A trapper's year is a circle made of ovals. Fall up the river. Winter down the log road of memory. Spring along melt water that tells secrets for a few weeks. Summer repairing what the rest have used up. Carson rode the circle until it became a compass he could lend to others. He grew into the kind of man leaders borrow when they begin to suspect their maps are too clean. Not yet famous, he was already the answer to a question men learn to ask when money and purpose venture onto uneven ground. Who can take us there and bring us back? His reputation traveled ahead in useful ways. He will not waste your water. He will not test a river where it is in a mood. He will not talk when listening is the job in a canyon one winter. He watched the clouds sit wrong on a ridge and moved camp a mile with the kind of authority that does not ask for votes. Morning arrived with an avalanche where their blankets had been. No one made a speech. They poured coffee for the man who had made sure they were there to drink it. Under starlight he could read a slope by touch. Under noon glare he could find shade with the intelligence of a lizard and the charity of a father. He carried a rosary in one pocket and a whetstone in the other and used them both with equal attention. When the fur trade bent toward its waning hats, learning to prefer silk, strange learning the quiet that comes when traps are fewer, Carson felt the wind shift and did not argue. He kept the skills and turned them toward the next kind of work the country would require. An ambitious and opinionated, was about to need guides who could translate between what the land allowed and what the capital imagined. A lieutenant with a politician's appetite for mountains was drawing lines on paper that needed to be verified by boots. His reports would become national narratives. For that, he needed a scout who believed in distances more than in adjectives. Kid Carson tightened his cinch and squared his hat. The next miles would be official miles. He would treat them with the same care he had treated private ones. Ink meets altitude. A pen rides behind a mule train. The Republic stretches its arm and asks the mountains to hold still while it sketches. Official journeys are a different weather. They travel with instruments and intentions, with salaried hunger and maps that hope to be right. John C. Fremont brought science and publicity to the trail. Barometers, sextants, notebooks craving the names of unnamed things. He also brought a gift for sentences that could make Congress lean forward to keep the sentences from floating away. He hired Kid Carson to pin them to the earth. In 1842 they moved out along the Platte, where cottonwoods plant their green flags and bison write history in hoof notes. Carson rode with the modest authority of a man who is already committed to bringing everyone home. His guidance was not romance, it was a series of small, correct decisions. Camp here, where wind is less opinionated. Cross there, where the river's voice is friendly. Wait a day, because the sky has promised a mood and will keep it. Men who had never learned the language of landscape began to pick up the alphabet under his quiet tutelage. How a ridge tells you what a valley will say, how a bird's sudden silence means the weather has changed its mind, how a broken twig tells time. They climbed to South Pass, where the continent remembers how to be low, and looked west at a geography that did not care about committees. Fremont rode with patriotic altitude. Carson checked the pack cinches. Both labors were necessary. A year later it was the longer expedition, Oregon's river worries. Then south to the Great Basin's honest emptiness. Maps trembled when they touched the Sierra Nevada and asked whether a line could cross, where stone was busy being forever. Winter answered no in a tone that was not cruel so much as factual. Snow turned paths into conversations about appetite and prudence. Carson's sense for shelter became the difference between a report submitted and a list of names guessed by widows. There were hard moments, food that decided to be scarce, animals that remembered their wild ancestors too vividly, men who had to be asked to choose between pride and breakfast and who. The kids helped Joe's breakfast in time. He scouted ahead with one other when pots needed, proving, and he turned back without shame when the land said later. Fremont's pen took what Kid made possible and gave it a nation's attention. Reports printed in Washington spoke of peaks and passes with a clarity that owed much to the scout, whose handwriting did not fill the page, but whose judgment filled the days. In 1845 they went again. California in the mind's eye like a promise that refused to stop being made. Politics thickened the air. War's first syllables gathered in corners. Guiding under such a sky is more than navigation. It is diplomacy conducted with silhouettes and distances. Kid kept the party small when small was wise, large when large dissuaded inquiry. He spoke to rancheros with the right hat in his hand, and to native camps with the right silence first. Trouble found them anyway, as trouble does when boarders begin to imagine themselves loudly. Skirmishes threatened to become stories nobody wanted printed. Carson was the one who turned volume knobs down when down saved lives, up when up moved men out of an ambush's mouth. Once, when Fremont needed Washington to hear news before Rumor Ray wrote it, Kid rode east across a country that did not promise to be gentle. He traveled with a speed that looked like stubbornness from a distance and like loyalty up close. He delivered the dispatches into hands that smelled of ink and power, then turned around to return to a world that smelled of leather and weather. Such errands made him famous by accident. Capital learned his name as a synonym for reliable under impossible conditions. He did not stay to enjoy it. He belonged to the work, not the applause. What did Fremont learn from Carson besides roots? How to write reports that respected gravity. How to let the landscape be the main character. How to credit the quiet, the man who chose a ford, the mule that didn't balk, the woman in a far settlement who traded bread for news. Carson learned, perhaps, that a republic draws maps with sentences and that a sentence can be as sharp as a surveying chain. When it comes to the future, by the time the expeditions had finished sketching their portion of national ambition, Kid Carson was a kind of hinge between older trails made of fur and newer roads made of politics. policy. Between beaver talk and telegraph talk, between private competence and public consequence, the hinge would creak necks in ways that still bother a conscience tuned for fairness or assigns men jobs larger than their preference. California will change flags, dispatches will gallop, a scout will become a courier of events to beg for any saddle. It begins the way a front rolls in slow at the edge, sudden in the middle, and afterward everyone swears they saw it earlier than they did. In California the air thickened with declarations and misunderstandings. Bare flag rebels stitched the banner and tried on nationhood like a coat they would outgrow in a few weeks. Navy officers discovered that diplomacy suffered from the time it took to cross oceans. Carson's job did not change in theory, move people safely across difficult ground, but in practice, it widened to include the moods of commanders and the pace of history. He guided Fremont through choices that tasted political. He carried messages between men whose signatures carried cannons behind them. Whether they meant to or not, he made sure that when meetings happened, they happened in places where the horizon did not surprise the participants with unwelcome company. When Kearney's column approached from the east like a paragraph eager to join the story, Carson became the comma that made the clause make sense. He led them where water waited, warned them where sand was practicing treachery, and, at San Pasquale, witnessed the kind of fight that teaches respect for terrain and a tone all generals understand. He carried dispatches to Washington that rode faster than gossip and arrived earlier than regret. The journey east was a lesson in distances that the telegraph would soon shorten, but for now it was still a matter of horseflesh and human spine. As a Wild West man, he entered offices where carpets muted courage and delivered words that tilted policy. Secretaries who preferred their heroes eloquent found themselves admiring a man who used adjectives rarely and accuracy always. He could have remained a little while to taste the odd sweetness of being necessary in rooms. He did not. He turned and went back to where events were not yet edited. Borders changed, treaties put their names down like stakes. Maps gained lines that would look inevitable to school children and improbable to those who had seen the ground through it. Carson tried to keep his own ledger clean, help the living reach evening, help the lost find a path, help the loud remember the quiet exists. But the work ahead would not fit neatly inside the scales of a trapper-turned-guide. It would require a soldier as rank and a bureaucrat as endurance, and would leave behind knots that words cannot untie. A man who knew how to pass gently through other people as countries will now be asked to move people out of their own. Cadence must remain calm while truth remains complicated. Here are chapters a nation reads in a whisper afterward. This is one by the early 1860s. Where else were pulled uniforms west in new colors, agencies sprouted like fence posts well-meant, ill-built, or simply convenient. Settlements multiplied on lands that had their own names before the new names arrived. Carson wore Union blue and a colonel's responsibility. Orders asked for the subduing of dying Navajo families whose home was not a point on a map but a fabric of canyons, fields, flocks, and holy places braided together by memory and ceremony. He had parleyed with them before, shared food and terms, known the value of distance kept and promises kept. Now the strategy from above married scorched earth to persuasion, and the union birthed something that would walk with sorrow a long time. Fields were burned to smoke the people out. Sheep well on for legs were taken and slaughtered not for need but for leverage. Bow guns emptied under the pressure of hungry months and cavalry hooves. Carson's hand in this is debated in tones that rarely reach comfort. He argued for mercy sometimes, for rations to prevent vengeance from finding seed in children. He also carried out orders that made mercy late to its appointments. The long walk followed. Men, women, children moving under guard from canyons that knew their names to a boss that did not. The road was not long in miles alone. It measured itself in blisters, funerals, and prayers spoken without answer. At Bosque Redondo the experiment failed in ways ordinary people could have predicted. And officials could have, too. Water disrespected crops, disease learned too many faces. Promises leaked through paperwork. Years later, a treaty would carry dying back toward home, not unchanged, not paid back, but moving again toward the canyons that had kept their rooms unpainted and their doors unclosed. But of Carson inside this, he did not write a defense eloquent enough to erase facts. He did not write an apology large enough to replace them. He worked inside a machine and sometimes tried to oil it, sometimes simply kept it running, and sometimes looked away because men do when the view begins to measure them. None of this unlearns his earlier grace. All of it complicates it. A life can be both a bridge and a barrier at different hours. History refuses to simplify that for our comfort. In the quiet register of ASMR truth, we can say this. Kid Carson spent seasons helping people cross hard ground and one season helping to make ground hard for people who had a prior claim to it. Both are true. The breath should slow here because the country's will did not. After orders, winter. After movement, a chair near a stove. After noise, the steady labor of remembering fairly. When work loosens its grip, a man inventories. Not aloud, not all at once, but in the way he stacks wood and checks the latch before bed. Carson's later years bent back toward towels and small dignities. He served as an Indian agent with the bias of a translator, trying to make two languages say yes at the same time, trying to trade paper for food and signatures for patience. Some days he succeeded. Many days he merely slowed failures so they would do less harm to the children. He farmed, which is a kind of apology the land accepts without asking for phrasing. He wore fatherhood like a familiar coat and let his house be a place where travelers could warm a story to drinking temperature. His health, never theatrical, began to edit his days, a fall, a fever, the way breath shortens its sentences when a body decides to prefer chairs to saddles. In 1868 at Fort Lyon, where the Arkansas writes its brown arguments toward the east, Kid Carson's story closed. Its eyes, he left behind a widow who had learned both patience and insistence, children who knew the exact size of his kindness, and a country unconvinced about what to do with the contradictions it had asked him to carry. What remains trails safer because he read ahead, reports clearer because he refused to let adjectives outrun facts, a legend smaller than Crockett is in volume but longer in its usefulness as a model of attention and a shadow we must own. The season when its competence was yoked to policies that hurt people who deserve better. If we are to keep the good, we must keep the true. How does this hand the road forward? From traps to trails to telegraphs to stage roads, Carson S. Hinge swings us toward a figure who robbed with politeness and left poems stuffed into Wells Fargo-esque daybooks. Country is now webbed by routes and timetables, Romer rides coaches, news rides inks, and a thin man in a dust coat will dismount on a hill, wait for a stage, and introduce himself with a rhyme. Mail roads, quiet boots, a bandit who says please. The Old West learns a new kind of theater, less gun smoke, or pen stroke, and the legend machine discovers how much it enjoys a villain who writes neat. The Old West does not begin with a gun. It begins with footsteps, soft leather on hard ground, a creak of harness, the hush of wind pushing sage into small waves. Before there were headlines, before there were wanted posters thumbtacked to boards they clicked in the evening, there were people following rivers and rumors, carrying small hopes in big countries. The road west is a long inhalation, each town a bead on a string of dust, each night a lantern seen from far away. Telegraph poles will come, railroads will come, newspapers will come and shape noise into narrative. But first there is the simple fact of distance and the way distance edits a person down to will and skill and the company they keep. A boy becomes a scout becomes a guide becomes a name, and names in America are things the wind likes to carry. So we begin where the Atlantic chatter grows faint and the grass spends all afternoon practicing silence, with a homespun politician who loves stories more than speeches, a buckskin traveler who read landscapes like letters, and the long, slow tightening of a country learning the weight of its own future. Settle in. Breathe slow. We will move by small campfires from one life to the next, letting each leave a warm handprint. On the one ahead, the first handprint is a coonskin shadow against a tall wall in Texas. It is not the end of a story, it is a door. Davy Crockett, a name that sounds like a smile pressed into syllables, a handshake you can hear. He was not born in the West, but the West recognized him when he arrived. He learned woods before he learned rooms, tracked weather before he tracked votes, and carried a fiddle tune in his pocket for when knights asked for kindness. In Tennessee, river fog teaches a person how to walk softly. Crockett learned the grammar of tracks, tear spelling itself in hubs. Bear writing heavy sentences no one should misread. People liked him because he could make a hard thing sound lighter than it felt. A cabin going up, a hunt gone long, a winter that wanted more than it gave. He had a way of telling what happened, so that the telling paid you back for listening. Politics came the way weather comes, not entirely invited, but carrying rain a field might need. He went to Congress with buckskin still in his voice. He spoke against things that made poor folks smaller. He fought with words and wit, which is another kind of marksmanship. But Washington is a distant country from a ridge at dawn, and Davy's compass did not like marble rooms. When he lost his seat, he said it plain and bright as a lantern. You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas. Texas in the 1830s had the gleam that appears on the edge of a map, opportunity for some, peril for many, a tangle of promises and debts and flags. Crockett rode toward the glare with a small company in a large mood. He carried his stories like provisions. He carried his rifle like punctuation. On the road west, he collected kindness the way a traveler collects directions. A cup of coffee here, a patch of hay there. Each stop he paid with a song or a joke, which is a coin that never goes out of fashion. The Alamo was a mission that had learned how to be a fort. Its walls were thick with decisions made in a hurry. Men inside counted powder slower than they counted breaths. They had come for reasons that rhymed but did not match, and now they all shared the same narrow roam called time. Crockett arrived not as savior, but as company. He played his fiddle, made the cold feel less personal, walked the walls and measured distances the way a hunter does from shadow to door, from door to field, from field to where a man might stand if he wanted to vanish or appear. Outside, the army gathered like weather, flags bright as warnings. Drums that did not tire died inside. Men wrote letters with hands that did not shake. They ate what could be eaten and spoke of home without making it hurt. It is possible to be brave and still be human. Crockett told a story about a bear so big it had a zip code, and the room laughed because the room needed to. When the walls were finally tested, there was no cleverness left to spend. Only cartridges, only angles, only the arithmetic of last stands. The legend says Davy fought until the air ran out of places to put gunpowder. Another says he was captured and stood straight while the world tilted. Legends are the way a community refuses to let gratitude be quiet. What matters for a long road is this: Crockett did not end the West at the Alamo. He began it for others. News carries faster than horses when it travels inside grief. Back east, the name Davy Crockett arrived like a letter everyone thought was written to them. Boys carved rifles out of sticks and learned that a story can be a kind of armor. In the territories that lay beyond the Alamo's shadow, men who would later scout and ride and measure maps against their own courage learned that a person could be humorous, honest, and still choose a wall nobody expected to hold. On quiet nights, Kid Carson would sit by a small fire and listen to the wind sleep in the sage. He would think not in speeches, but in simple lines about paths and purposes. He did not know Crockett, but the echo of a man who would not run taught the next man how to walk on. The road leaves San Antonio and tilts upward into country that trades trees for sky. A single rider moves north and west with traps and stories and a map written in rivers. His name will be Kit. Night folds around the camp like a patient cloak. The Coles keep their small red eyes. Somewhere, a coyote practices a joke it never quite finishes. Davy wakes early because men who have slept outdoors learn that dawn has a sound far sooner than it has a color. He rolls his blanket, thanks the ground for being steady, and checks the rifle that is not a prop in a story, but a quiet promise in a country that asks for proof. Roads in the 1830s are not lines. They are agreements. They are the kind of paths that exist because hooves remember them. He follows one such memory westward, from ridges that cup Tennessee fog to bottoms that hug the wide brown backs of southern rivers. Along the way, he collects people the way a stream gathers leaves. Not to keep, but to carry a little while. Blacksmith who measures men by the way they lift a hammer. A widow who does not like politics, but likes laughter just fine. Boy who wants to know if coonskin is as warm as it looks. Davy's jokes are currency. His fiddle is change for $1 of bad weather. He pays for hay with a song and for silence with the kind of listening that makes a stranger feel like a neighbor. On ferry planks that clunk and shiver, he crosses water that looks like it is trying to remember the Atlantic. He watches the way the light skims the current and thinks about how quickly stories move. When they float downstream with grief for a sail, he is headed for Texas. Not because Texas is simple, not because Texas is safe, but because his compass points to places where choices aren't finished yet. Arkansas welcomes him with pine breath and roads rutted like a frown. He eats cornbread that tastes like somebody's animated with opinions. He sleeps in a loft where mice hold a small convention and agree to leave him be. If Farmer asks what Congress is like, Davy says it is like a barn dance where the fiddler can't hear the feet. The farmer laughs into his hands and gives him a place for the mule. There is a company gathering men with good hats and poor boots and a talent for hoping aloud. They have heard distances mispronounce their own names and think that maybe they can help with the grammar. They ask Davy to speak. He does not declaim. He tells a little story about a bear, about standing your ground when the ground tries to roll you off, about the way a man has words sits heavy or light depending on how often he lets it down. They sign on. Not to him, he says. To each other. The march is not really a march. It is a long courtesy call on the map. They cross creeks that bite at the shin and prairies that look like the sky forgot where to stop. They pass cabins where dogs announce them and kitchens where the air tastes like ash coffee. And care. At every stop, Davy notices what keeps people together, a quote with 20 hands in it. A hymn that knows 3 notes but for harmonies. A shovel leaned against a door because a family has agreed to plant itself here and see if the ground agrees. He learns the names of little towns that will grow into big names, and the names of people who will never be printed on anything, but will be remembered on porches for years. Why Texas? Someone asks at a fire that snaps at its own jokes. Because it's a place where a man has to introduce himself, he says. And I still like telling my name. They enter the long, lean edge of Texas where the light seems taller and the distances don't blink. Spanish mixes with English the way to rivers become one wide thought. Mission bells remember older days. Cattle trails wobble like handwriting. News moves opposite them fast, breathless, full of numbers that change when rattled. The Alamo will need men. The Alamo will need time. The Alamo will need luck. Davy has brought only one of the 3 in any quantity. He can offer men. He can offer himself. He cannot bring time, and he has never believed in luck that wasn't worked for. In the cottages, a woman gives him a ribbon for the hat of whichever man needs it most. He tucks it away with a nod that means, this will be used for courage, not decoration. He meets men who will become footnotes and men who will become songs. Some shake his hand too hard, thinking the legend requires it. Some grip softly and trust the eye. He likes the second kind. On a day when the sun feels like an anvil, they come upon a wrecked wagon, hub split, barrel burst, flour crying itself back into dust. They put it right. No speech. No ledger. Just the fellowship of getting something unstuck. Davy knows that is all a country is, finally, a long list of things people pulled out of ruts together. Rivers slow them, then teach them how to be slower. They learn the kindness of a ford found at dusk. They learn the impoliteness of a bank that looks gentle until a foot slides and a man as pride takes a path. They camp with Comanche once, not close, not far, mutual regard measured in the distance between fires. A nod dot a horse traded for a mirror that throws a sunrise back at itself. A child laughs and everyone forgets to be ceremonial for a few breaths. Prairie is a large, patient teacher. It teaches the value of shade, the price of water, the humor of wind that has decided to speak all day. Davy rides with his head low and his eyes higher than the brim. He is not looking for a fight. He is looking for a place where his particular mixture of story and spine belongs. At night, he thinks about Washington and feels no bitterness. He thinks about the Alamo and feels no romance. He thinks about the line between being brave and being useful, and he hopes to land on the useful side when the line tilts. A courier finds them with news that moves too quickly to be held without spilling. Santa Anna marches with a certainty that makes other men's certainties look like posture. The Alamo's roster thins under the arithmetic of attrition. A man can count powder in minutes. He cannot count chances until later. Davy takes off his hat, straightens hair that will not be straightened, and says to the company what he always says when the road needs lifting. We'll go on a little. Ways more. That little ways becomes long ways. As it always does, hoof leather thins. Boot heels learn new shapes. Men trade jokes like canteens and carry silence like a necessary load when laughter runs out. They pass through San Augustine and hear rumor buzz like a fly that refuses a window. They pass through Gonzales and learn what come and take it sounds like spoken by people who do not need banners to mean it. When they near San Antonio, the air itself feels strung, like wire before telegraph, like nerve before pain. They rest the last time. Bread and beans. Coffee with an apology in it for white shoulders against blue sky scarred with use and resolve. Inside, men who have already spent days more expensive than most lifetimes look up and find in Davy's arrival exactly what they needed, not a savior, not a speech, but a man who makes rooms warmer because he is unafraid to be ordinary. While the world asks for ceremony, he moves among them like a good song, nothing fancy in the melody, all the comfort in the tune. He checks the angles he measured in his head before he ever saw them. Shadow to door, door to field, field to where a man might stand and become the right kind of problem. He plays the fiddle once more, not because music can stop an army, but because music can keep a man from becoming smaller than the job he must do. Letters are written again, this time by new hands. Names press ink into paper that will outlast bone, and the ink does not tremble. Dawn finds them practicing the discipline of staying put. Men who were drifters become part of a wall. Men who were talkers become part of a silence. Davy walks the parapet quietly, the way a father checks doors at night. He nods to a boy whose whiskers have not yet gotten their orders. He nods to a man who has more mustache than optimism. He nods to the flag and thinks about how cloth and conviction make each other brave. And the first real test presses its palm against the gate. He feels not fear, but recognition. This is the kind of arithmetic he understands angles, seconds. The music of a shot placed where it won't be lonely. He works, he jokes, he aims, he steadies a friend's hand and borrows a calm he will return with interest. The days stack up. The nights learn each man as name and call them one by one to the wall and back. Exhaustion comes like weather and leaves like weather, and in between there is simply work. No one believes they will be rescued in time. That is the strange mercy of the place. Hope, freed from wishful thinking, becomes attention. Attention becomes accuracy. Accuracy becomes a kind of kindness you pay to the men next to you. If a story is forming, if the wind is already learning a new refrain to carry, no one says so aloud. They are busy being necessary. The drums outside will not tire. The letters inside have no room left for adjectives. Between the two, a fiddle waits on a nail. Men who have chosen a wall measure the hours by the way the sun visits the courtyard and leaves again without comment. Drums outside, letters inside. Between them, the ordinary work of courage. The siege does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like chores. Gun carriages creak into place. Artillery coughs, and then remembers how to clear its throat. Men inside the walls measure powder with the care of. While there's measuring medicine, they stack barrels against doors and small jokes against fear. Davy learns the timetable of noise at first light. Distant calls roll across the flat's bugles with a high shine of confidence. Commands that carry farther than they need to, because someone wants the sound to do part of the fighting. By mid-morning, the gun teams test. Range. At noon, the air tastes of limestone and smoke. Evening brings a quiet that sounds like a question waiting to be answered tomorrow. He moves where a hunter would move, not where the danger is loudest, but where a small miscalculation could become a large problem later. He mends a loophole with a plank and a prayer. He advises a boy with hands that shake on the first day and do not on the third. He checks the angle of shadow that will be useful when the sun drifts to the far wall. Colonel Travis writes, "Words like victory or death do not feel like theater here. They feel like math." James Bowie, fever-sick and iron-willed, sets his jaw and gives orders from a bed that looks surprised to find itself a headquarters. The garrison, varied as a deck of cards, settles into a rhythm. Texans and Tejanos, volunteers and regulars, old hunters and new whiskers, all learning each other's names faster than they expected. Nights are the kindest hours. The air cools. Stars gather above walls that have never looked so much like part of the sky. Someone sings a hymn softly. Then someone else adds a harmony that does not quite fit and becomes beautiful because it tries. Davy's fiddle makes its circuit not every night and never for long. He plays just enough to remind men that the word together has a tune. A few steps away, someone writes to a mother in a hand that will be hard to read and impossible to throw away. Another man buttons his coat up to his throat and pretends that makes the night warmer. Work returns with first light, repair, reposition. Rotate men so no one stares too long at the same patch of field and begins to see ghosts in the grass. Once, at midday, Davy and two others slip out to drag in a cask fallen outside the gate during a hurried shift. They move low, quick, exact, the choreography of people who have stopped wanting to be noticed by history. They succeed, and the water tastes like it came from a better world. Across the lines, the army grows thicker, brighter, more certain. New cannon noses blink in the sun. Colors of the standards look greener and redder than cloth has any right to be. Bands play marches men's feet don't need, but nerves do. On the fourth day by Davy's count, he has begun carving small notches in a post where no one will think he is keeping score. A shell finds the chapel wall and teaches it how to exhale dust in a long surprised cloud. The men blink white and grin anyway because blinking is an admission of humanity and grinning is a way of agreeing to be brave. They shore the breach with timbers and barrels and the kind of attention that is the opposite of panic. Food thins into ingenuity. Coffee becomes an idea flavored with memory. A man decides a stale biscuit is tastier if he shares it, and he is right. The messenger brings a rumor like a warm coin in a cold hand, reinforcements moving somewhere. Sometimes, somehow. The wall does not lean less because of the rumor, but backs straighten for a few hours as if words could do carpentry. Davy walks the line and talks about weather and mules. He speaks the dialect of ordinary days on purpose. He knows that men do not hold their breath well for long, so he gives them a reason to exhale. There is a skirmish at the low fence line near the eastern corner where weeds argue with stones. A small party slips forward at dusk to worry the besiegers and is worried in return. Shots skip like thrown pebbles. The men reappear inside the gate with 2 extra rifles and 1 fewer hat. No one gives a speech. They make room for more men on the wall. Bowie worsens. He turns pale in new shades and wills each breath to make the next one. He sends for Davy not because Davy is a doctor, but because Davy is a story that reminds Rome what men can be on a good day. They speak briefly. Bowie's eyes hold the kind of gratitude that does not need grammar. Davy leaves a ribbon a woman gave him in the cottages on a nail by the bed. A small, useless, exactly right gift. The days learn how to be twins. Artillery at distance. Work up close. A cheer when a shot from the walls topples a distant hat. A muttered curse when a shot from the distance bites a nearby stone and sprays sting into a friend's cheek. Travis gathers the men and draws a line. Not with eloquence, but with chalk. A simple invitation. Choose the side of yourself you can live with. Most step across as if the floor had been patiently asking for this dance. If you do not, some of those return later quietly, which says more than speeches ever will. One evening, after a day that used the word almost too many times, a norther slides down the plain. Wind stiffens flags and tempers. Men pull blankets tighter and pretend to sleep while listening for the kind of silence that ends in trumpets. Davy lies awake thinking of creeks in Tennessee, and a Congress that sounds like furniture being moved too often, and he measures his life not in years but in the number of people who have found a way to laugh around his fires. Dawn chooses a particular morning to be earlier than expected. Before the light is a color, horns called the dark. Columns rise from the grass like ink lifting from a page. For a heartbeat the world holds the calm that lives at the very center of storms. Then the air fills with answers. The defenders move as if they have rehearsed a play nobody wanted to stage. Positions taken, muskets shouldered and fired, ramrods working like metronomes, voices short and specific. Here, lower, now. Ladders bite the walls, hands find purchase an old mortar. First men up are brave in the way that uses itself up. They are met and unmade with the precision of people who have practiced being necessary. Davy holds a corner where a shadow makes the angle kind. He does not waste shots. He does not raise his voice. He shares a look with a boy who has become suddenly older and nods a small nod that means, "You are doing the job." Cannon smoke folds and unfolds, turning the courtyard into a room made of weather. With a moving gray, Davy sees details the way a hunter sees, boots that hesitate on the third rung, a sash that marks an officer asking for a careful argument, a gap where the wall's improvised ribs will need a new shoulder. First rush fails, pulls back, finds itself again, returns with the stubbornness of people who have learned that persistence is a tactic. The defenders answer with the stubbornness of people who have learned the same thing from smaller lives, and now apply it to a larger one. A flag topples on the far side and is set right by hands that do not want the day to misunderstand them. Travis appears and vanishes in the smoke like a sentence someone keeps trying to remember exactly. Bowie's room becomes very still and then busier than any room has a right to be at that hour. Once more the assault pulls back. A hush tenses the air. Davy hears over the ringing that has moved into his ears to stay. while the creak of a distant wheel and the birds who do not yet know what men have decided. He tastes ash and limestone and the bitter humor of coffee that will not happen today unless someone does something miraculous. He looks along the parapet and counts faces by hats, by shoulders, by the way a man sets his jaw when he has accepted his own orders. He thinks that this is what a country is too, a line of people deciding together. But they will allow to happen in the space between two walls. The next rush is closer, heavier, shaped by officers who have learned from the first to failures. Scaling hooks find better bites, more ladders bloom against stone. The defenders begin to give ground the way a careful gambler folds. A hand only when the table S-math insists. In the chapel, men raise sight a gun by inches and make those inches count. At the low wall, a knot of fighters becomes a hinge that swings again and again against pressure it cannot entirely stop. On the north side, a breach grows like a bad idea. Davy moves where there is a need and then again where there is another need. He becomes 3 places in a minute by will and practice. And the minute agrees not to tell the truth about physics. Then the field tilts. Not all at once and not for everyone, but enough. Grappling becomes closer than marksmanship. Names are shouted as if names can stiffen bones. The man trips and another hand keeps him from staying down long enough to be a story. The courtyard, shy at dawn, is crowded by full light. Smoke thins into a harsh honesty. The angles that were kind grow blunt. Davy feels time change shape. It stretches and shrinks, a long breath held while a fuse decides, a short breath released when a ladder disappears backward in a clatter of failure. Somewhere, the gate complains in a voice that means it has done all it can. Somewhere else, a prayer finishes itself without words. He realizes that the arithmetic he knew at first light has changed its teacher. He does not despair. He adjusts. He sets himself to be useful a few more times. He thinks of the ribbon by Bowie's bed and is glad. He left it. He thinks of Tennessee water and lets the memory be a sip. He thinks of the way music can make men stand straighter, and wishes there were a minute for a single note. When the wall finally gives its permission in the place no one wanted it to, Davy helps move men to the next place where permission has not yet been granted. He makes his last shots count as if a ledger is being kept by someone fair. He is not concerned with how he will be remembered. He is concerned with whether the man beside him will feel alone. For even a moment longer than necessary, the day tips over. Shadow gathers at the corners of the courtyard like witnesses with their hats in their hands. The air is full of endings, but no one has time to pronounce them. What happens to each man in the final minutes will be told differently, by different mouths and different ears. We will not dispute them here. We will only keep the fact of attention that Davy Crockett spent the hours he was given paying attention to the people next to him and the job in front of him. And that attention, even when it is not enough to change an outcome, changes the shape of the story the outcome becomes. The smoke will drift. The letters will travel. Newsprint will learn a new refrain and carry it across rivers and rails. Boys will carve rifles from sticks. Politicians will borrow courage from men they never met. And far to the north and west, a young trapper named Kid Carson will roll in his blanket and look at the morning with a scout his clear eyes, ready to read the next miles and hand the road onward. Smoke has a way of finishing the sentences fire begins. It rises, spins to wind, and goes looking for listeners. After the Alamo, the smoke drifted east in the form of a woman on a worn horse with a child in her arms and a story in her mouth. It drifted as a servant who knew the names of men now silent. It drifted as letters that left San Antonio on saddles and slid into parlors. Like weather arriving through the door instead of the sky, rooms learned new stillness in kitchens. Coffee cooled untouched while news found the right size for people's hands in barber shops. Men removed hats without thinking why and sat with razors idle. On river boats, strangers performed the ceremony of agreement without speaking. This will matter to us longer than. Today, newspapers did what newspapers do. They reached for sentences big enough to hold grief and useful enough to carry action. Printers inked phrases that would not wash off soon. Somewhere an editor found for words that could be shouted or prayed with equal force. Remember, the Alamo, the phrase did not bring men back. It brought men forward. It put boots in stirrups and hands on reins and made ordinary people feel the sudden certainty that the next miles were their business. On the prairie to the east, the runaway scrape gathered up families, women with children, men too old or too necessary to be elsewhere, and moved them away from the gravity of an army. That meant to keep moving. Wagons groaned like old doors. Creeks argued. Some nights, mothers told children the stars were counting them so none would be lost. Sam Houston did something that looked like cowardice at a distance and like mathematics up close. He retreated. He measured days and drills, and in the length of a green log's burn, he preserved a small army the way a careful cook preserves starter for bread not yet baked. Round campfires where men wanted speeches, Houston offered orders. He taught feet and muskets where to be when the time finally turned from subtraction to answer. He collected rage and let it cure until it would cut. Letters from the East Coast crossed the letters coming from the West. Congressmen said things that made them feel better. Mothers said things that made their sons braver. Publishers said things that made their papers sell. Meanwhile, the land did not editorialize. It kept its long habit of being itself when rehearsing one note all afternoon. Grass inventing patterns. For the pleasure of it, creeks trying different ways around the same fallen limb. Santa Ana advanced with flags that enjoyed being flags and drums that liked their work. He believed in certainty the way some men believe in family. His columns moved with the dignity and appetite of empire. But empire has a blind spot for the arithmetic of small places. A bend near a swampy water called Buffalo Bayou and a prairie called San Jacinto, a plan the size of a pocket knife unfolded. Houston let the men rest in the afternoon when pride would have kept them upright, then sprang them like a door. The battle was a short argument with a long echo, roughly 18 minutes of noise. Then the part of war that does not improve men's souls. Then a capture made of mistake and momentum. Santa Ana taken in a uniform that looked less imperial at close range, the phrase from Sand. Antonio found a new voice in a different throat, remember the Alamo. And for better and worse, the country learned again that grief makes a fierce fuel. Texas stepped from petition to proclamation. Borders were inked with the boldness of people who have recently won. Something in the vagueness of people who do not yet know what they have won, the United States. Would argue with itself about this enlargement until the arguing became a habit. What of Davy inside this widening circle of consequence? He did not become a general. He did not become a law. He became a story. That sounds smaller if you say it quickly. It is not small. Stories are the equipment a society uses to lift what is heavier than any single bag. In the months that followed, Crockett stood up in more parlors than he ever knew, a woodcut face and broadsides, a name in sermons, a character in theatrical pieces where actors wore coonskin caps, and made audiences feel brave and rose. Some of it was true. Some of it was rumor that liked the way truth sounded when it wore a little exaggeration for Sunday. In frontier cabins where news took longer to arrive and stayed longer once it did. He was remembered in a different register for a joke told when the stew was thin, for a hand steadied on a ladder, for the way a man can walk a wall without making the people below feel smaller for not joining him. The echo touched people who would never see Texas. Boy in Missouri traced the outline of the Alamo on the inside of his eyelids and dreamed of trails. A girl in Kentucky listened to her mother read from a newspaper until the words softened into music, and she decided that courage sometimes sounds like common sense spoken calmly. Far to the north and west, a trapper rolled in his blanket and watched the dawn dry on colors. He had a face made for silence and a manner built for distances. He was not a politician. He did not much enjoy roams, but he understood the utility of a story when it came time to persuade feet to move. His name was Christopher Carson. People would call him Kid because the land likes monosyllables it can say while chewing. Before we pick up his trail, the Crockett Echo has a little more work to do. It will ride boats up the Ohio and down the Mississippi. It will be sung off-key in taverns with floors that know the weight of muddy boots. It will be sketched in ink and later in decades not yet born, stitched into a kind of American fabric that itches and warms in equal parts. There were doubters, too, men who disliked the way grief was used to sell newspapers or elections. They had their points, but even they could not deny that a wall stood a while because ordinary men agreed not to leave it, and that agreement is of the rare kinds of news that stays new. The aftermath moved also through private lives. Widows learned new signatures. Children learned new chores. A nation learned again that maps are not drawn just with lines, but with decisions. When Houston met the press after San Jacinto, he did not speak for long. He let the facts carry themselves like men carrying their own rifles. He kept some phrases for the future because the future would need them. When night fell on the prairie that had held so much sound, the stars performed their old duty of making noise look temporary. Kid Carson turned over in his sleep, listened to a river talk about directions, and decided to go where the river wanted to take the day. How a tall tale opens a wider trail, a coonskin silhouette becomes a signpost. Guides take work from newspapers as much as from maps. The Santa Fe Trail waits for a man who reads sign like scripture and weather like news. Tall tales are not lies, they are ladders. They help people climb from what they have to what they might have. After the Alamo, Drecka acquired a new ladder. Davy Crockett's name became a rung you could step on when your own ground felt thin. Publishers were quick with ink. The Crockett Almanac's pamphlets with jokes and prodigious bears and arithmetic, done in laughter, made their noisy rounds through towns where the postmaster was also the gossip and the mayor, and the man who sold nails. Some readers believed every word. Some believed none. Most took what they needed and left the rest to travel on. Theaters learned the prophet in a coonskin cap tipped just so. A fiddle tune at curtain up. A speech that mixed homespun with honor until they tasted the same. Was any of it exact? Not often. Was it useful? Very. Because while newspapers and stages performed their work in rooms, other business was going on outdoors. Trails needed walking. Rivers needed ferrying. Mountains needed the courtesy of a respectful path. Men who guided quiet, spare, the kind of men who look at a sky and decide on a camp found that parties arrived with Crockett in their pockets. Not the man, not the facts, but the permission he represented that a person could be ordinary and brave without contradiction. Courage of that type fills saddles. It hires wagons. It writes letters that say, "Come after us when the oats are in," and the letters are obeyed. So the road west grew busier. The Santa Fe Trail stitched Missouri to New Mexico with thread made of oxen and hope. The Oregon Trail threaded farther. California roots daydreamed gold before gold remembered its own name. Into this weaving stepped Kid Carson, a man who did not wear legend loudly because legend is a noisy coat and he preferred quiet. Weather, he trapped beaver where water rode its arse backwards in mountain bowls. He learned the dialects of Athabascan and Ute and the polite distances between fires. He could make a mule respect him and a colonel trust him, which is a rare combination and worth more than uniform. Braid, what did Crockett have to do with Carson? More than it seems, they never shook hands. But the tall tale made a climate in which guides were valued not just for rhyming, but for returning with a story others could follow. Explorers and officers' men with assignments tied to Washington and maps inked by committees wanted a scout who could move through country without teaching it to hate him. Carson fit the need like a key that has learned the lock by listening, and when the time came for John C. Fremont to write reports that would sell Congress on the shape of mountains it had not seen, he leaned on Kid's quiet sentences the way a tent leans on poles. You don't notice until they are gone. Meanwhile, the Crockett story kept doing its quieter work. In cabins with one book that wasn't scripture, children learned to spell their names and then learned to spell Texas because it felt like a new letter had been added to the alphabet and they wanted to try it. Merchants painted signs that nodded to a frontier fame they had never met. Barbers hung a cap in the window, the way an innkeeper hangs a sprig of green to say the house keeps the right company. Of course, the comedy of it ran alongside the gravity. There were men who sold more bravery than they had in stock. There were politicians who wore frontier stories like borrowed boots to loose at the heel to tight at the toe. There were newspapers that could make a scarecrow look like a regiment. But underneath the show was something that did not need a ticket, an ethic of mutual aid, and straight talk of rooms warmed by songs and walls held by attention. Guides like Carson practice that ethic daily. When you lead people who are not built for the country you're crossing, you learn to be gentle with fear and impatient with carelessness. You learn to see a storm to hours before it matters and a bad decision to days. Before it gets named, Crockett's usefulness here is subtle. He normalized the idea that a public figure could be both. Brave and kind, he made space in the national mouth for sentences that began with we instead of I. He prepared ears for reports from men like Carson who wrote without spectacle, and yet carried whole ranges on a page. As rails crept west and telegraph wires began teaching air to speak in clicks, a new connector joined our long chain. News no longer needed a saddle, it could borrow lightning. Dime novels would soon press frontier names into thin paper that folded into back pockets. Not all of it would be careful, enough of it would be enduring. And when the century turned its shoulders toward harsher kinds of order agencies, reservations, Courts, the stories collected along the way served as a complicated conscience. They reminded the country that courage is not the same as conquest, and that a famous name is poor payment for a promise not kept. At night, round fires that kept travel parties from feeling like separate households. Someone would mention the Alamo without drama, not to spark speeches, but to pass around the old, chipped cup of resolve. A man would sip and sleep better. A woman would hear the coyotes' tune, their choir, and decide the dark was populated by patience, not malice. In a camp where Fremont's outfit mended tack and waited for dawn to thaw a trail, Carson straightened from the fire and listened to the kind of silence that tells you the weather has made up its mind. He pointed his chin, and men who had not grown up knowing that language began to understand it. They rolled their blankets with the efficiency of people who have accepted that tomorrow is not optional. Remember the Alamo, one of the younger hands said softly, without heat. Carson did not answer with words. He checked a cinch and moved the mules off the frost-bitten patch where their breath made little. Clouds with honest opinions. He was not a slogan man. He was a miles man, and miles are what our story needs next. The old West learns new habits when roads learn new names. Mail roads, stage lines, schedules pinned to walls where clocks are still getting used to themselves. Wells Fargo coaches run like arteries. Through hills combed by oak and chaparral, dust keeps time. Drivers keep faith with teams that know the route by smell and slope. Shotgun messengers sit tall beside them, watching the brush where a stick can look like a barrel if a man has nerves need convincing. Into this theater walks a thin figure in a linen duster, a flour sack with neat eye holes pulled over his head like a shy curtain, and a double-barreled shotgun held with the care a librarian gives a rare book. Please, gentlemen, the voice says calm, even throw down the box, no shout. No profanity, just the kind of courtesy that makes the moment stranger. Driver and messenger judge the odds. They see no posse in the brush, no horses snorting a cue. Just a figure who seems to have practiced this scene until the script fits like a glove. The chest comes down. The stage breathes again. He does not fire. He does not hit. He does not harm. He lifts, he leaves, and the dust closes the door behind him. Soon the name will arrive, Black Bart, though the man beneath the sack has another name for cards. And family. In some tellings, he is an English-born boy who grew up on American rivers. A miner who learned disappointment in sluices that loved other men better. A Civil War veteran with quiet shoulders and untidy ghosts. He will sign himself sometimes Black Bart, poet, which is a joke and a calling card. A promise that his robberies prefer rhyme to blood. But names come later. Tonight there is only a hill above a stage road and a man who has rehearsed the angles. He has selected this place for reasons the map understands, a bend that slows a coach, a grade that makes horses grateful for excuses, a thicket that frames a figure so neatly the driver reads it as certainty. The shotgun may be empty. It may be loaded with promises instead of shot. No one is in a mood to test it. When he is gone, the messenger will swear the robber was polite enough to help lift the chest down as if it were a neighbor's trunk. The driver will say the man apologized for the inconvenience as if the road itself had performed a discourtesy. Both men will agree that nothing about the moment wanted a bullet. By the time a posse tastes the hell's dust, the figure has become brush, and the brush has become a trail a careful foot refuses to teach. A week later, another stage on another road. The same calm voice. Please, gentlemen, the same end. Newsprints notice. They have a weakness for paradox, a robber who says please, a villain who leaves poems. They lift their hats to the novelty and give him a corner of the front page that turns him into habit. Wells Fargo notices more soberly. They do not like losing boxes in a pattern. They assign detectives who know that patterns are invitations. One of them, James Hume, begin to keep a notebook whose pages smell like ink and patience, and the stages keep running. Because mail is a promise and the country has agreed to count on it. Between holdups, the man we call Black Bart moves like weather on footpaths and back roams. He travels alone the way some people do not mind silence. He sits in small hotels and reads quietly with a face that makes proprietors think of schoolmasters from better towns. He pays in clean bills. He does not drink much. He tips with the kind of exact change good men like to give. In the brush he is careful and modest. He does not trample sign he will need the next time. He borrows a hill's shadow and returns it without creasing it. Rendezvous with himself, he practices what he will say to frighten men and chooses words that keep hands steady on reins. He knows the value of lowering the temperature of a moment. He knows that fear is messy and mess is noisy and noise brings company he does not want. So he takes the box, leaves the manners, and goes. Home, if we can call any place that a woman might remember a husband who left for gold and came back with a way of looking at tables as if they were ledgers. Years collect on a face, but a gentleness remains in the voice the way a river keeps a curve after a flood. Poetry arrives like weather too, a scrap left in a box, a stanza pinned to a bush where a messenger will find it when his breath returns to curiosity. Rhyme is simple, the hand neat. It is not genius and it is not foolishness. It is a gesture, a signature that is less a dare than a smile. Here I lay me down to sleep, he might write at one scene to wait the coming morrow. The press approves. Public approves more. Proving a thief is a national pastime when the thief behaves and the bank looks fat. Wells Fargo does not approve, but they do not scold. They double guards where roads invite surprises. They brief their men to shoot only when shots have finished negotiating with other options. They pay Hume to think between holdups. And Black Bart goes on not every week and not with a clock, but with the kind of cadence that makes a detective as pencil draw circles on a map, and then frown at them. The West, for its part, learns a small lesson it did not expect to learn, that danger can be courteous, that a stick in a thicket can be a gun if a calm voice frames it correctly, that a road to predictable is a road a poet can schedule. The next parts will follow the poems and the pursuers. For now, fold the day like a letter. Someone has signed it with a name that is not on any baptism roll and sealed it with dust. A villain who says please becomes a column inch with a grin. A detective corrects his spectacles and decides rhyme schemes are clues even when they aren't. The theater of the stage road gets a playwright. The poem on a stage road is a strange flower. It grows out of fear and relief in the thin soil of a messenger's humor. The sheets are scraps, torn from a notebook that smells like tobacco and time. The lines rhyme in plain couplets like footsteps that insist on walking together. Black Bart. Poet, the signature reads. Not poet, exactly. Poet, as if the number shows he knows the joke and invites you to enjoy it too. The newspapers love it. They print the verse with the same plea they reserve for train timetables and opera notices. A bad man with good manners is an editor's day off. Bart's poems do not appear at every scene, only at a few, which is how gifts should be given. They say little and accomplish a lot. No blood, no boasting. Only the sense that the robber is staging the event for everyone's benefit. A script takes shape. The stage rounds a bend and slows. The figure appears with a sack over his head and a shotgun that may or may not be full of thunder. The voice is unhurried, the words rehearsed but not theatrical. The chest is lifted down like a picnic hamper. No pockets are rifled. No passengers are shamed or searched. The robber tips the brim of the idea of a hat and vanishes where a deer might choose to vanish. On a hot day, James Hume, the detective, writes all this down. He has the patience of a man who lets coffee go cool while he compares footprints. He keeps clippings in an envelope that is not yet thick. He marks dates, roads, grades, proximities to creeks, who drove, who sat shotgun, which boxes were full to the brass and which were just heavy with rumor. Patterns emerge and blur. Bart favors the Northern California Gold Country, Sonora Road, Copperopolis grades. Valleys where oaks scatter shade like coins. He prefers uphill pulls where teams lean into harness, and the crack of a whip would only insult their effort. He picks days when the heat sighs or the rain persuades men to think of home. Hume interviews drivers who do not want to sound like men who cooperated, and shotgun messengers who do not want to sound like men who blinked at the wrong second. He is kind in the way that extracts more facts than pride. Meanwhile, Bart polishes his act by subtraction. No companions, no horses, no shots, just a walk-in. Walk-out theft with the soft decorum of a polite stranger who has the misfortune to need your cash box urgently. He leaves behind a rumor that in the brush above the road stand gunmen ready to shred any resistance. Sometimes the rumor is helped by sticks set cleverly to look like rifles. In a nervous man as peripheral. Mostly the rumor is just the echo of an imagination that dislikes being the only coward present and invents company. Public negotiates its feelings. Stage robbery is a nuisance when you have a letter on board. It is a thrill when you have not. Bart becomes a story told in barber chairs while the lather cools, and in kitchens. While the bread does the same, children recite the signature, poet, and learn that numbers can be jokes if you let them. Wells Fargo negotiates nothing. They count losses. They calculate the difference between fear and ferment. They raise a bounty that makes thirsty men listen harder to strangers at the far end of the bar. But thirsty men do not catch Black Bart. He does not frequent bars that waste his silence. He prefers rooms whose wallpaper minds its own business. He keeps a small wardrobe that suggests schoolmaster more than saddle tramp a neat suit for town. A traveling face that remembers to smile and then forgets. He pays laundries and reads newspapers and steps around puddles the way men do, who dislike stains on cuffs. Poems thicken the persona like syrup. They also give Hume something to fold and unfold at his desk while he considers ink as evidence. The hand is neat. The diction is tidy. Not quite educated in the college sense, not quite careless in the camp sense. A man between places, or a man who has been in both. A rumor says Bart was once a miner insulted by spokesmen for Wells Fargo. Another rumor says he is a clerk who takes a vacation every few weeks for reasons his employer will misunderstand later. A third rumor says he is from nowhere in particular, a man manufactured by the irritation of roads too regular to survive unmolested. Hume likes facts better than rumors. He sketches a face from descriptions that match only in the thinness of the subject. He draws eye holes on a sack in his notebook and writes beside them, polite.com. Efficient, alone. Poems are not proof, but they are a robe. Someday, he thinks, the end of one will be tied to a name. Until then, the roads go on being roads. Torches keep their appointments with towns that count on them. The messengers keep their watch. And a thin man with careful hands rehearses an apology he may never have to use. Patterns harden, then crack. A stage lurches, a messenger gets lucky. Footprints remember what a handkerchief forgets. The more a man repeats a trick, the more the ground learns it. Roads do not memorize you, but men who drive them do. By 77 and 78 or thereabouts. For dates move like wagons on soft shoulders, Bart. As visits have acquired reputations of their own, drivers mutter to horses on certain hills, coaxing them with jokes that hope to offend fate into silence. Messengers keep thumbs near hammers when a bend feels like a man waiting to happen. Sometimes nothing happens and the day tastes like relief that tries not to be superstitious. Sometimes the sack appears and the voice says please and everyone acts the way their wives would want them to. Once, a messenger fires. The shot goes wide because surprise is a poor marksmanship instructor. Bart does not answer in kind. He thanks the man for the warning and concludes the business with a speed he respects in others too. Another time, a driver refuses. Bart sighs a small sigh a schoolmaster might sigh when a boy insists to plus to his 5. He adjusts the angle of the barrel and lowers the angle of the man's enthusiasm. The chest comes down. No one bleeds. A mask left and brush tells a story in canvas and dust. Eyeholes cut with a tidy hand. The whisker snags, which could mean the wearer is close-shaven or careful or both. Cut of the sack does not tell a tailor anything, but it tells Hume that the robber likes neat in small things, which argues neat in larger ones too. Boot prints are modest. A man who lifts his feet instead of dragging his heels. Weight not heavy enough to make the mud ring at the edges. Which suggests a frame that spends more time reading than plowing. On a hill above the Sonora Road, sticks are planted where rifles might rest if men were present to rest them. No men are present. A stage crew that saw them earlier did not lie. They merely told the truth their nerves had edited. Hume walks the scene with the steadiness of a man who has learned to translate nerves back into objects. He notes the new cut of the grade, which has made teens struggle in giving a robber a better excuse to be believed. When he asks the chest to oblige him by coming to ground, he wants better luck, and luck is often something carried in pockets by laundrymen. In towns along the routes, Bart becomes a parlor story. He is older in some tellings and younger in others, more dashing here, more ghostly there. Children sketch a robber with square shoulders and a sack like a private moon. Mothers remind them that politeness is a virtue even when practiced by the wrong people. Fathers remind themselves that guns solve fewer problems than they start when money is all a man wants. Bart eats in rooms where men do not glance beyond their own plates. He keeps a hat that does not force clerks to remember him. He folds his napkin. He tips. He reads the paper without moving his lips. In a small San Francisco lodging, a guest named Charles Bolton to some, Bowles to others. Names are coats we try on. Pays to have shirts done by a laundry that marks its customers with numbers and letters. That tell their own small poems. Hume cannot see this yet, but his notebook is moving toward it the way a river curves toward a confluence, even when rocks insist it shouldn't be. Near Copperopolis, a stage labors uphill. The air tastes like hot iron. Brush takes a breath. The sack appears. The voice says please. Something different happens. A messenger, young and stubborn in the way youth tries on bravery like a borrowed coat, waits a beat too long before obeying. A movement, a flash, a report that space remembers. Bart staggers. He does not fall. He completes the scene with the same rigor he brings to all his scenes. The chest is down. The road gives up its goods. But the brush receives a drop of blood and a piece of cloth that has opinions about soap. The stage goes on. The robber goes off. And luck quietly trades teams. Laundry marks do not forget. A detective with a pencil learns to speak washerman. A polite voice acquires a name with a draft. Number and a prison term's length. Evidence likes to pretend it is shy. It drops itself in brush and whispers from pockets. But it enjoys company when a patient mind sits down beside it. At the Copperopolis scene, deputies gather threads. Among them is a handkerchief with a mark sewn by routine, letters and numbers that mean nothing to mountains and everything to laundries. James Hume does not rush. He has a city's worth of steam and starts to interview. He visits laundries until the smell of lye becomes a kind of cologne. At each counter he shows the mark. At each counter he watches the clerk's eyes move from cloth to memory. At one, the eyes say yes. The mark belongs to a customer who signs a CE. Bolton, who sends shirts that prefer clean corners, who tips fair, who reads without fidgeting, who lives in modest rooms where the window minds the street and the tenant minds himself. They walk to the lodging. Clerk points the way with a finger that understands the gravity of pointing at a man other men have been looking for. The door opens onto a room that reveals a life lighter than it could have been and heavier than its tenant hoped. A small trunk with a soldier's thrift. A suit brushed within an inch of its pride. A hat that a stage driver might not recall. A shotgun that remembers grease more than powder. The man is thin, composed, and resigned in the style of someone who has already had a long conversation with himself and lost politely. Mr. Bolton, Hume says, or shall I call you something else? The eyes consider the weight of continuing. They set it down. Charles Bowles, Bolton, Bowles again, admits the thing that needs admitting. Not with drama, with the same economy he brought to Hills. He says he never fired a shot to hurt a man. He says he preferred not to frighten ladies and tried to frighten gentlemen only as much as strictly necessary. He says the poems were for levity, not for insult. The chest count rives to meet the confession. Dates shake hands with dates. Roads nod to roads. Ink enjoys its own arithmetic. In court the public enjoys the odd spectacle of a bandit who speaks like a neighbor. He does not posture. He does not apologize in florid paragraphs. He simply accepts the portion and the place. San Quentin receives him like a ledger receives a new column. Years are written where months used to be. The gate closes with a sound that pretends to be final and is only thorough. Behind stone, a man who loved the feel of a good shirt crisps into a routine that asks little and takes much. He reads because reading travels without breaking rules. He keeps to himself because trouble prefers company. He minds his manners because manners belong to him and not to the state outside. Stage roads continue their appointments. Drivers tell newer men how a sack once contained a voice that made bullets unnecessary. Messengers keep watch with the same care as before. Because the world invents replacements for famous men without asking permission, Hume closes a notebook and opens others. When asked how he knew, he points to patience and to laundry marks and to the axiom that repetition is a habit, that likes to wear the same hat to town. Papers run cartoons of a bandit in a sack reading a book behind bars. Children laugh in ways that do not lose sleep. Wells Fargo posts a notice that says the roads are safe again, and then quietly pays the next detective to remain unconvinced. Years pass the way water passes a rock. Slow, then sudden, then as if nothing had ever changed. Parole arrives like early spring. The gate opens. The suit looks like it remembers how to be a suit. The head sits uncertain, then takes its position and decides to act as if nothing has happened to Hetz in the meantime. Charles steps into a light that does not recognize him. Journalists ask him if he will rob again. He answers with the dignity of a man who would prefer a private question and answers a public one anyway. I am through with the road. Perhaps he is. Perhaps the road is through with him. After prison, a few sightings, then rumor. A letter here, a story there. The remainder of a legend that preferred footprints to headlines. Freedom after stone is a thinner kind than the songs suggest. It does not open like a gate. It opens like a book already half read. In San Francisco, a man in a neat suit walks streets that prefer noise. He visits a tailor who remembers measurements better than names. He eats in a dining room where waiters practice being invisible. He signs a register with a steady hand and a name with fewer letters than he used in poems. A reporter finds him once and writes a column that tastes like triumph. The man in the column says he is done with roads and would like the city to return the favor. The city nods the way cities do and forgets. Sightings pile up like postcards without addresses. A stage driver says he saw a familiar set of shoulders watching a coach labor a grade, and then turn away as if tipping a hat to the past. A shopkeeper in Nevada swears a polite stranger bought paper and left a coin to write for the purchase. A hotel ledger in a small town records a Charles who stayed 3 nights and read by a window that watched the road but did not judge it. No robbery follows these sightings. No sack appears. The poems keep their own counsel. Some say he went east. Some say he went quietly to ground in a place that asked no questions so long as the rent was on time and the sidewalk was watered on hot mornings. Some say he died in a room where the news never found him and where a respectable suit hung on a chair back like a memory of a different man. Legends prefer open endings. They like to leave chairs empty in the corner of the story where a listener can seat his own uncle, or neighbor, or the polite stranger he sat beside on a train once. What Black Bart leaves behind is small and strong, that violence is not the only theater, that manners can manage moments guns would spoil, that a road is safer when both sides of the transaction understand the transaction will be brief, and nobody needs to practice speeches. Wells Fargo prefers other legacies, and we do not begrudge them that. Mail should arrive, drivers should go unmolested, the cash box should keep its secrets until a bank unlocks them, but in the gallery of Old West faces, where scowls and scars often take up entire frames, a thin man with a linen duster and a sack with neat eye holes holds a corner with a smaller smile. He made a nuisance into a ritual that spared blood in an age that often worshipped it. In the larger braid of our story, Bart has staged poems tie a bow between the polite confidence, the road agent, and the noisier celebrity that newspapers will hand to men like Wild Bill. While Bart was moving boxes off stages with apologies, Deadwood heard a chair scrape back from a card table and a man in a frock coat turned to catch a bullet meant for the legend more than for the person. From the quiet robber, we pass gently, chronologically enough, to a gunfighter whom headlines loved hard and who learned how headlines end. Newsprint learns to be hungry, a long coat, a pair of pistols worn but forward, a gambler's smile on a borrowed chair in a mining town that never learned to whisper. Prairie teaches a long breath, grass is lean, sky opens. Horses mark time with tails and soft snorts. In this big quiet a boy learns to listen. James Butler Hickok, Illinois first, cornfields and creek water, chores that ask more of the back than the mouth. Parents who prefer plain talk to tall talk. A farm makes hands honest, a winter makes plans humble. The boy grows long in the leg and quick in the eye. He learns that a fence keeps cattle where they should be and that a finger keeps a trigger where it must be until the moment asks otherwise. Neighbors mention Kansas as if it were tomorrow's bigger room. Wagons head that way, chains creaking, children counting crows, men arguing roads like preachers argue verses. Young Hickok goes too. He hires on where work is the pay and the pay is work again. He rides in relays. Wires meet him where horses used to. Telegraph poles beginning to teach the wind new syllables. Stage stations are small countries. Bacon, coffee, news. Boots by the door, stories on loan. He learns the distances between one water and the next. He learns that a stranger in a doorway must be measured by eyes before he is measured by words. He learns that a card game carries the decks, the pasteboard one on the table, and the invisible one made of reputation. Some men come quick to the second deck. Hickok will be one of them. First, there is scouting. or makes maps hungry. Armies prefer men who can read weather and who sign without singing about it. Hickok rides advance and flank, chooses ways around trouble where a straight line will be brave and foolish at once. Later, there is law, or the frontier version of it. A badge in a place that does not love badges, a town that drinks before it eats, a street where a gun on each hip is a kind of grammar. He wears his pistols but forward, nodding to cavalry habit or personal comfort, and the posture becomes a paragraph other men read without knowing why they have understood it. First echo of the name comes in a Missouri square at noon, a quarrel that chooses the middle of the day for its stage, a man named Tut. The watch used as leverage, a string of insults wound too tight to loosen. To figures across open ground, breath held by windows, that set low on brows that prefer shade to spectacle. A single shot writes a lesson the papers will over-punctuate. One man falls, the other does not. A duel is a poor teacher for most things, but it teaches the town that a rumor has bones and the rumor learns to walk outside state lines. Wild Bill, papers will say. The name fits like a coat borrowed from the weather, a little large, flapping at the edges, but warm enough to travel in. Hickok does not hunt headlines for their own sake. He hunts quiet. He wants nights when chairs lean back on porch rails and the moon minds its own business. But a man's work and a man's myth make arrangements without asking him. He leaves the square with new gravity. Men who liked him still do. Men who doubted him stop doubting out loud. Trails call again. Stock to move. Passengers to guard. Small towns where someone must be the hinge that keeps a door from slamming. He practices the kind of courtesy gunmen respect, not flowers, not flourishes, but hands visible, voice low, orders clean enough that disobedience feels like extra work. Cards add a second income and a second risk. He plays them the way he rides, reading faces like horizons, taking his time until time insists. In the mirror he sees a face the century will remember, mustache like a signature. Hair long as if scissors owed him money, but the eyes are not a costume. They're the tools of a man who weighs rooms. He is not invincible. He is careful. Care is the difference. By the time Cattletown starts sprouting, tracks reaching them like sentences reaching periods. Hickok's name can walk into a saloon ahead of him and order a drink without being refused. The work will ask more, and the papers will pay him back in coins that spin strange. Newspapers and the making of a celebrity lawman. A reporter arrives with questions that want their own answers. Dime novels sharpen pencils. Abilene and Hayes learn how a town sounds when a man in a long coat decides to stand in the doorway. Until the room behaves. The railroad brings change on a timetable. Cattle follow it north like a brown river trying on a new mouth. Towns erupt at sidings, throw up false fronts, hang real hopes, and hire a lawman in the afternoon because morning was too gentle to admit it. Hayes City first, then Abilene, places with more whiskey than patience, more pistols than hymnals, more money than manners for a season at a time. Hickok pins on a badge the way a man buttons a coat before stepping into weather. That prefers other coats. He does not lecture. He occupies doorways. He sets a rule invisible and immediate. If you start a thing, finish it where it hurts fewer bystanders. If you won't, I will finish it for you. He speaks softly when he can. He moves first when he must. A report arrives, Eastern paper, ink ambitious. Questions with answers already attached. He wants measurements. How many men? Murdoch Hickok. How many bullets? How fast the draw? How far the shot? Wild Bill smiles his small smile that offers a man the chance to be less foolish than his notepad. He gives numbers that are either modest or impossible depending on the day, and the reporter goes home to write paragraphs that will sell. Dime novelists smell a name like wolves smell bacon. They feed it adjectives, drape it in adjectives, teach it tricks it never performed, and sell it back to towns where no one cares about footnotes. In the novels, Hickok is 7 feet tall. He can split a playing card at 20 paces with a revolver he whirls like a baton. He retrieves children from Comanche camps with one hand while signing autographs with the other. In life, he is a lean man with good boots, a calm voice, accurate hands, and a dislike for trouble that looks like a taste for it from a distance. Still, press and truth do a kind of business together. Paper names bring him jobs the tax roll might not have. Paper stories give him leverage in rooms where leverage is the most honest kind of speech. Abilene learns him quickly. He does not chase men up and down the street like a dog after wagons. He meets them and shortens the meeting. He writes small finds in the air, collected in obedience. Sometimes it bangs. Sometimes it doesn't. He prefers the second kind of night. He makes enemies by being the kind of friend most men wish to their better selves. A man who insists on the room at its best version of itself. He makes friends by doing the same. On off days he hunts with the precision of habit, or sits at cards wearing luck like a coat he did not pay for and is not sure he should keep. Buffalo Bill Cody passes through scout, showman, and seed, friend enough to share a table. Colleague enough to share silence, they will later share a stage. With Bill learning how applause tastes, and Hickok learning he prefers coffee, the dime novels grow wilder. Hickok grows tired of being. Taller on paper than on streets he must actually walk. But the stories refuse to step backward once they have discovered their own stride. So he leans into the practical, which is his way of leaning out of the noise. He keeps Abilene livable. By the simple practice of showing up before trouble believes it is expected, the town begins to stand a little straighter. Merchants count more coins and fewer holes in windows. Families begin arriving earlier in the season and staying later. Cost comes to not in money but in the bookkeeping of a man's nerves. A lawman spends sleep the way a gambler spends chips. He keeps a little aside for mornings and a little more aside for the night he hopes will be quiet and is not. And sometimes when a town behaves, the job becomes lonelier, because a man made for pressure feels unnecessary in peace he helped arrange. The next part will thicken the K and OT Abilene's hardest evening, shots that carry farther than intention and a decision to leave while dignity is still standing. Abilene, the shot in the street and the weight of a badge. Third second in front of the Alamo Saloon, a muzzle flash that solves one problem and makes another. A deputy's body, a town's breath held too long. Some towns deserve an apology from the wind. Abilene on a payday night is one of them. Music spills from doors that cannot close on it. Boots scuff boards that have memorized the weight of impatience. Laughter carries an edge, not cruel yet, but sharpened. Hickok walks the boardwalks the way a captain walks a deck loaded with cargo that likes to roll. He nods to men who want to nod back and to men who don't. He watches the corners of rooms where anger collects like dust. A man named Phil Cole owns part of a saloon and all of his own pride. There's a quarrel, perhaps about signs, perhaps about a dog, perhaps simply about two men both accustomed to their own gravity. In the street, words make room for the rest. Cole fires first, or fast enough that argument ends. Hickok answers with the accuracy he keeps for moments that need it. Cole folds. The street inhales his harsh breath. Then the second shape in the smoke, a man moving fast from the corner of vision, friend to Hickok by badge, Mike Williams, a deputy whose timing writes its own tragedy. Hickok turns, sees motion framed by powder haze, and reflects instead of name, fires once more. Accuracy punishes the wrong problem. Williams is on the ground before the street can take back the second. Silence makes a room out of the outdoors. Faces become statements. Hickok steps into the middle of the noise and reduces it, orders given without heat, weapons put away, men guided home with voices that do not invite argument. Later, in the office where a lamp has learned how to console paper, he sits with the badge and the cost of it. No court is harsher than a man who meant to do right and did not manage it in time. He keeps order through the end of the season because quitting in a storm is not his way. But the shape of his days changes. Saloon doors look like questions. Cards look like excuses. Sleep does not do as much work as it used to. When he leaves Abilene, he leaves with the small dignity of men who ride out, instead of being asked to. The town stands. The trains come and go. The streets grow less theatrical. That is part of the goal. He drifts, not aimlessly, but toward places where a man can be necessary without being a headline. Scouting again. Cards again. Hunting, which is a kind of prayer when practiced with respect. A stage company hires him for presence as much as for protection. He is the sort of insurance a ticket can buy without printing it on the stub. Passengers relax when his head brim is between them and the world. Friends persuade him onto an actual stage. Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack offer lines and applause and travel with trunks where rifles and costumes share a vocabulary. The playbills call it Scouts of the Plains. The audience calls it a good night out in towns that have learned to clap on cue. Hickok does his part like a man paying a debt he doesn't owe, professional, polite, not particularly amused. The script makes makes him into his dime novel self, and he carries the weight of it without dropping it on the night. His eyes begin to trouble him more. Maybe light bothers them, maybe print blurs when he wished it wouldn't. Maybe years of dust and squinting have decided to charge their interest. He does not complain. He adjusts, as men do whose pride lives closer to competence than to image. The road points north and west. Mines, fresh towns, stakes and streams. Black Hills country where gold and trouble rive holding hands. The name Deadwood has the kind of honesty a map appreciates. Hickok rides toward it with a hope for quiet that should know better. Deadwood, a brief marriage. And cards in a noisy town. A wedding band in Cheyenne, Calamity's orbit, a chair in a saloon where a man sits with his back to the wrong door. A man can still want peace after years of noise. In Cheyenne he finds a different kind of room, a circus widow named Agnes, a ceremony small and sincere, a promise made without a pistol within reach. They speak the vows the way plains folk do, without lace, without extra weather. Hands held, eyes honest, a future imagined that prefers laundry lines to headlines. Work pulls, it always has. He rides soon after toward the Black Hills with the calculation of a man, trying to collect a little stake before being a husband in one place for more than a week at a time. He says he'll be back. He means it. Deadwood is a town that refuses to whisper. Tents make promises they cannot keep. Canvas rubs up against ambition and produces static. Gold tells lies it learned from other men's eyes. Hickok enters the noise like a quiet hinge. He does not declare himself. He becomes a chair at a back table, a pair of cards handled without flourish, a hat brim low, a voice used only when it improves the moment. Calamity Jane moves through town like weather, fierce, funny, loyal, unregulated. Her name will be tied to his in ways both fair and storytelling. They are companions of a sort that defies registry. Respect lives there. So does distance. A few men want to test the dime novel from up close. He discourages them economically, small sentences. Precise refusals, no extra punctuation. He prefers the table's conversation, bets, banter. The arithmetic of risk the way gamblers prefer it, with little theater and much attention, a habit. Grows. He sits with his back to the wall. In Deadwood a man keeps an extra habit or two. But one afternoon the seat he prefers is taken. He chooses a chair that faces the room wrong and the door right for someone else. A deck shuffles. The saloon adjusts to the slow heat of afternoon. Somewhere outside a mule disagrees with freight in the language of mules. A young man without much to commend him beyond impulse walks in carrying a grievance he believes is a plan. Jack McCall, a name not yet famous and eager to change that. He moves behind the chair with the wrong view. Hickok senses men like him always do. But the angle is unkind and the second too short. A shot turns a crowded room into a very small one. Cards flutter in a burst like startled birds. The chair skids. Silence claps its hands. The story the town will tell forever arranges itself quickly, aces and eights in the fallen hand, black and spade heavy like a joke the night plays on future historians. Whether the cards truly sat that way does not matter to the legend. The legend has selected its wardrobe. McCall runs into a street that will now never be empty for him. Justice staggers a little, then gathers itself. Deadwood will argue procedure before it learns to spell it. Friends lift the man who tried not to be a statue while alive and now has no say in becoming one. Calamity weeps and swears. Fierce as weather again, but this time colder. Agnes hears the news far away and knows why the letter feels heavier than its page weight. Had married a man who belonged to rooms where noise collects. She kept the quiet ones ready anyway. Pound continues, as towns must when they have promised too many miners too much beer to stop abruptly. But a new hush lives under its laughter. Legend, aftermath, and the hand we keep remembering, trials, retellings. Old friends writing articles, Calamity's version, Agnes's life. A head hung on a peg the wind still tries to knock down sometimes. Deadwood tested justice the way Wedwood tests a match. McCall stood before a Rome that wanted to be a court and answered questions as if lives were better suited to mountain air than to city halls. He slipped through once territorial tangled jury that preferred entertainment to verdict. Later, elsewhere, a different court remembered its job. The sentence matched the hole in a saloon afternoon. The rope remembered its own instructions. Meanwhile, Hickok's name did not lie down just because the man had. Buffalo Bill wrote his version honoring, promoting, remembering, stylizing. dime novels redressed their hero for a final act and found the costume fit too well to retire. Calamity told and rattled the parts that hurt and the parts that tried to warm the hurt. In her mouth he becomes larger and kinder by turns. In some tellings he promises things a grave cannot keep. Her love, whatever shape it took, becomes part of the national scrapbook. Agnes returned to work, a widow accustomed to audiences who would never applaud for the correct reasons again. She kept his ring, kept her schedule, kept her dignity. Friends remembered the quieter pieces, the way he handled a quarrel by adjusting a man's temper as if it were a crooked picture on a wall, the way he played a hand without letting his partner feel small for losing one, the way he stood in a doorway without making the doorway feel threatened. The dead man's hand learned to be aces and eights because the town needed a shorthand. Cards have always liked standing in for fates. Players tucked the phrase into hats and told it to each other with the same mixture of awe and superstition that keeps ships from changing names. What does the legend keep and what does it misplace? It keeps the calm. It misplaces the reluctance. It keeps the accuracy. It loses the appetite for quiet. It keeps the coat and the mustache. It misplaces the way he preferred to finish a night by stepping into air that smelled like dust cooling in the gentle register for sleeping. We can hold both versions without waking the room, the dime novel that entertained the country, and the tired man who preferred a wall behind him and a low-voiced table before him. Graves forget arguments. Deadwood's Hill keeps its storytelling posture. Visitors leave cards on stone, some black with eights and aces, some jokers. Some notes that say thank you for keeping Rome safer for a while. The West keeps its parade moving. From Hickok's stage, Calamity takes a bow for a life that wandered. Then Bass Reeves rides into a different kind of law, one of the dime novel's excess. All of the badge's endurance. Before we hand the road on, let the breath slow. Let chairs settle. Let the saloon quiet down to its furniture. See the table in the corner with no easy seat for the back-to-the-wall man. See the cards on the floor, maybe those cards. Maybe not, and bless the room for the good nights it hosted when nobody needed a story. Before the West called her by a storm's name, she was Martha, or the Jane Canary or Canary in some ledgers because clerks and wind spelled differently. A Missouri beginning. 1850s light on creek water wagons that sounded like decisions, a family that moved the way hope moves forward because anything else felt like standing still. Childhood on the road as a teacher. Without recess, you learn which boards rattle in the wagon floor, which mules sulk, which clouds are simply making a face and which will actually weep on you before noon. Loss came early. Father's shoulders suddenly empty of plans. A mother's hands that had held everything together going still. The sort of silence a child notices before adults admit it. Martha became useful the way water becomes cold in shade. Without ceremony, she cooked when a pot needed filling. She soothed younger ones when nights were long. She learned that kindness and work are the same words spoken at different temperatures. Some histories make neat lists, her life preferred braids, dishwasher, cook, dance hall worker for. A season when coins were thin, freighter's hand when freight needed hands. Nursed by instinct long before someone called her that. Somewhere on the road between jobs and judgments, Martha leaned into a saddle and discovered that a seat built for distance was as close to home as the map had offered her so far. Horses don't gossip. They cross country. They accept a rider on proof, not rumor. Clothes followed the work. Buckskins rode better than bustle. Boots outlasted shoes. And had wide enough to carry rain made more sense than a ribbon pretty enough to collect it. Men looked twice at first, then looked forward when they learned she could drive a team through a royal mud that would swallow a lighter hand. She laughed with her mouth open and swore with the words that had learned to be helpful instead of ornamental. And the name Calamity arrived the way nicknames do, but the story told often enough to fit. One version says an officer capped. Egan was thrown in a patch of scraped neck in a dangerous conversation with the ground. Martha rode, lifted, kept a man alive long enough for a doctor to arrive late and say thank you. Call me Calamity if you're my enemy, she supposedly quipped, and Jane if you're my friend. Another version is simpler. Calamity attached to her like birds to a ham. Because Rome's remember the most dramatic version of a woman, who insists on occupying them on her own terms. Either way, or the Jane became Jane to friends and Calamity to the rest of the country. That would learn to put her on broadsides and books when the day as work slowed enough to allow. Printing, the Plaid heard her laugh. Fort Laramie watched her swap reins for a rifle and back again without losing a beat. Camp cooks learned she would eat last if anyone looked hungry first. She rode as a scout sometimes, not the romantic poster kind, but the practical kind a column hires when maps need correction by boot. She reads sign the way a mother reads children, tracks that said who and when, smoke that said where and why, winds that said whether a long day would become a longer night. She drank too, sometimes like a person with more memories than shelves. The frontier sold bottles the way cities sell noise. She bought both in odd seasons and paid for both in mornings. Even so, men who liked to sneer found their mouths closing around respect when she rode into bad places and came back with less bad to argue about. She could hunt without waste, cuss without malice, and dance when a fiddle begged a roan to remember laughter. At stations along the routes north, her name preceded her by a mile and arrived softer than headlines would later teach it to be. Calamity's coming, someone would say, meaning, keep a plate warm, keep a cot ready, keep your curiosity polite. She was not tidy. She was not apologetic. She was useful, which is a better compliment west of the 100th meridian than pretty. One winter she sat by a sick boy's bunk for 3 straight nights, rocking her chair with the toe of a boot, counting his breaths and cussing heaven softly when he would not take broth until she told him a story about a horse that refused to be named until it had crossed 3 rivers. He slept. She didn't. In the morning the fever remembered mercy. Jane rode on. The road did not ask permission. It asked for stamina and a sense of humor. She offered both in a voice that could be warm as stew or sharp as a shovel, depending on who had earned which. Country was rearranging itself, telegraphs knitting, railroads plotting, gold whispering in hills that preferred to be left alone. And somewhere ahead of all that noise, a mining camp called Deadwood was busy inventing a poor man's Broadway. Jane would find her way there because the road and the story had decided to meet for a while. And she was a woman who went where the meeting was. Scout, nurse, and the camp that needed both. A column's flank, a river to ford, a smallpox blanket, and a cabin that leaks prayers. And a woman whose hands choose the job in front of them before choosing a legend to wear. There are days when a saddle is the right tool, and there are nights when a chair beside a bed is. Jane knew both rhythms. On the trail she rode a little ahead, not to lead, just to make sure the leading had a place to go. She pointed with her chin, a creek to please with itself, a draw that would bottle riders like beans, a cloud that meant more than weather. In camps she chose work that kept a circle intact, hauling, patching, breaking fights with a sentence instead of a fist when a sentence was willing to do the work. Then Deadwood's breath went ragged. Smallpox walked street to street like a bill collector with too many addresses, doors shut, pans. Water went still on stoves that had not cooled all spring. Voices dropped to the register people use when a room has decided to be a church for a while. Jane stayed, not a nurse by diploma, but by the ordinary decision to stand where standing helps. She washed linens until her hands learned the geography of steam. She carried broth to mouths too tired to want it and told jokes thin enough to float and strong enough to carry a spoonful down a throat. There is a quiet heroism that newspapers cannot print without ruining it. This was that. Rooms where no reporter would bother to write his name on the way, and only a chair, a bucket, a basin, a woman humming a tune whose words had moved away so the tune could do the heavy lifting. The doctor, when there was one, respected her without speech because there was no spare breath. Miners who had known her as the laughing woman with the blasphemous vocabulary now learned her in the slow voice of the fever as friend. Children learned she could make pain hold still for long enough to comb a tangle. At a door where a woman had fallen asleep upright, Jane slid the blanket from an empty pallet over the shoulders that needed it more. At another door where men argued about contagion and the price of courage, she argued back by not moving at all. When the wave eased, Deadwood stepped out into air that felt new. Men whose arms had healed shook hers like a pump handle. Women pressed bread into her hands and said little because gratitude prefers monosyllables. Town returned to being noisier than was healthy. Bars remembered their songs. Cards shuffled until they were satisfied. And Jane, who could be as rowdy as any room when spirits and paydays agreed, carried the new stillness inside her like a small lamp. Her orbit overlapped with the Wild Bill's now, a man who wore quiet like a tailored coat when rooms begged for it. She liked him, not as a poster, not as a dime novel, but as a piece of furniture a dangerous night appreciates having in the corner. Rumors sprouted that they were married, that they were not, that they planned to be, that they never spoke except when the air insisted. Deadwood enjoys rumors the way other towns enjoy parades. Jane did not correct many mouths. She saved her breath for work. On days without emergency, she drove stage. Because reins in her hands looked like they had grown there, she swore at mules affectionately. They answered in their native idiom and obeyed. On other days, she scouted for outfits that paid in questionable currency, promises, thanks, credit against future troubles. The map under her boots was the only ledger she consistently trusted. Deadwood would keep its appetite for theater, and the next act would be brutal. A chair taken by the wrong man, a shot from behind, a saloon reduced to a single small room where silence sat down hard. Jane felt the town tighten even before the report. Some people sent storms a county away. She was built that way. The shot that froze the room, and a woman who wouldn't leave the room alone. Cards in the dust, a name walking uphill toward legend. Jane grieving in the only language she trusted, usefulness. There are moments the West refuses to forget, because forgetting would make the next drink taste wrong. The afternoon when Wild Bill's chair faced the wrong direction is one of them, a crack. Breath dragged through a doorway and held too long, men turning into furniture. Jane arrived in the wake of that noise, found the room trying to make sense of itself as if sense were a table. You could rate level by shoving a matchbook under a short leg. She did what she always did when a scene asked for more than words. She worked. She helped move the body with a tenderness that made hard men clear their throats and look at their boots. She ran messages in a town that preferred rumors to mail, and made sure the right ears got the right ones anyway. She told a boy to fetch the doctor and told the doctor the facts with less tremor than the floor. Grief sat on her like a coat she refused to remove in case the weather changed back. She did not lecture the town about its appetite for spectacle. She kept the lamps filled and the rooms aired and the quarrels trimmed. Some say she claimed a marriage. Some say she claimed a promise of one. Some say she claimed nothing but the right to sit near the bed where friends took turns being alone together. However the papers printed it, Jane mourned in the steady dialect of chores. Deadwood kept moving claims to stake, freight to haul. Spats to upgrade into fights and then downgrade into apologies. Jane kept being where people needed not to be alone. She accompanied a prisoner once and stopped a lynch plan by standing beside him, reminding her crowd with her posture that justice prefers furniture and lamps to ropes and anger. It worked. Not because she was large, not because she was armed, but because she was unmistakably present in a way that talks men down from ledges without a speech. Children chased her across lots with the fierce affection kids save for dogs and ants. She cursed at them with the kind of affection dogs and ants understand. For a while the town's appetite for stories made work for her as well. When a tent show needed a guest, when a traveling journalist needed color, when a poster needed a name that looked like weather, Calamity Jane's pen stroke stood ready. She began to tell her own story in paragraphs that knew their audience, a version of the Egan. Rescue that glowed softly, pal talk wrapped around small truths like blankets around cold. Children, did she embroider? Yes, but the cloth was hers. And the room she earned with those stitches bought bread for more than one winter, and paid for more than one doctor as visit her pride would have skipped. Between shows she rode stages, freighted, helped where camps ran out of hands or courage. She never stopped being the person who could turn a day by picking up the job in front of her and finishing it, while others began to argue about whose job it had been. Country began to change shape again, tracks farther, telegraph faster. Boom towns maturing into towns that looked at themselves in windows and tried to stand up straighter. Jane, too, changed shape according to the wind and the pay. She was a scout when scouting hired, performer when performing fed, a nurse because there are always nights that need one. In the background, a quieter life kept raising its hand. A man named Burke would teach her the grammar of the word husband. A child named Jesse, if you believe the documents you prefer, would learn the math of having a famous mother on thin margins. But fame and peace do not share furniture easily. And the road, which had always been her easiest conversation partner, kept asking for one more ride. Poster boards and parlor stages, the years of telling and traveling. A train ticket pin with a safety pin. A Wild West show tent bright as a second sunrise, Jane on a stool telling a room what courage sounds like when it is tired and still shows up. Traveling shows learned to set up faster than a storm. Canvas went up, flags bragged. Bugles persuaded afternoons to become evenings. Calamity Jane joined more than one such parade, sometimes on the same poster as Buffalo Bill, sometimes with outfits less grand but just as confident they could sell a ticket in a town that had carried the day on its back all week and needed to be carried by spectacle for an hour. She wore buckskins the way she always had, like work clothes. She held a rifle the way she would hand it to a friend who needed it. She told the Egan story and the smallpox rooms and Wild Bill's quiet jokes and enough about herself to pay the printer and the boarding house and the laundry without lying so egregiously that her conscience forgot how to sleep. On stage, she was a strange kind of star, less glitter than gravity. She did not memorize speeches, she recalled rooms. Her audience came to be close to the person behind the name, and she delivered that person, not the invention. Between towns, the old habits tugged. A bottle as ballast, a quarrel with a manager who thought a woman's schedule belonged to him, a sudden gift to a family with a sick baby that left her broke and unashamed. Clinton Burke, husband by papers and testimony some years, comes and goes in the accounts. Like weather between towns, they opened a restaurant once, which is a form of optimism God himself honors with extra sunlight. It did not last long, but the coffee was good while it did, and the chairs knew they belonged to a home instead of an audience. A girl, Jessie, appears in the record like a bird on a fence post, present, observed, capable of flight. Dane's letters, where they survive, are tender and brief, like a person writing at a depot bench while the train breathes. The 1890s turned their pages. The West became museum and newspaper at once. Old stories under glass, new scandals in ink. Jane kept working. Sometimes she was a guest. Sometimes she was the whole show. Sometimes she was a reminder that fame is a tool you can swing at a problem until it solves itself or you tire of the noise. She aged in public and did not pretend not to. Lines came honestly from weather and laughing in nights that went longer than they should have. Her eyes kept their brightness, the kind you see in people who can still find the funny line in a bad paragraph in small towns. She would be recognized in a shop and the shop would find itself suddenly saved her. Sit. Miss Jane, rest. There's pie left from noon. Her thank you was practical, a story paid for with the coin. She carried attention and a verbal portrait of somebody's cousin who had been brave in a flood or a blizzard. She paid the world back in stories because that is the currency it had always paid her in. Late in the decade, she drifted back toward the Black Hills the way a bird circles a birthplace, without asking the sky to explain itself. Deadwood's hills had not forgotten her. They lifted their shoulders in that old way that says we can keep a secret and keep a friend. The body keeps ledgers even hearts don't see. Coughs speak first. Bones ask for chairs sooner. She gave away more than she kept, which is either sainthood or poor accounting depending on which preacher you ask. The last room, the quiet stone, and the neighbor she was buried beside. A hotel in Terry, a paper box of letters. A grave on a hill that makes jokes about pairing legends and lets the jokes become tenderness. The mining camp of Terry sits like a comma above a long sentence of hills. Boarding houses breathe steam in winter and gossip in every season. Jane found a room there in 1903. Bed that apologized for springs. A trunk that had learned to keep quiet. A few letters folded small enough to travel and large enough to mean it. Agnes's kind of tidy was not her kind, but they shared the discipline of saving what a person could not bear to lose. The last weeks were ordinary, which is how good ones often look up close. She visited, she helped, she borrowed, and forgot and paid back with stories that could be spent more than once without wearing thin. On an August day, her breath shortened its sentences. A friend found her quiet as if sleep had moved in and refused to pay rent. Men who had once argued loudly with her about nothing in particular now argued softly about who would carry. Deadwood, stubborn, theatrical, sentimental, decided on a resting place with the kind of mischief only affection can justify next to Wild Bill. Some say friends did it as a joke because the living liked to tease the dead into company. They did not choose. Some say she had asked for it because love is a kind of gravity that prefers no empty chairs. Either way, the hill at Mount Maria accepted both stones and made them neighbors. Tourists came. They still come. They look at the pair of names and make the easy story. They look longer and make a better one, that a woman who kept rooms warm during sickness kept roads safer by simply being on them, now keeps a small piece of ground warm by her presence. What do we keep of her? The laugh that didn't wait for permission, the hands that did what the room needed, the clothes that fit the work instead of the mirror. Contradictions the frontier teaches every honest soul, rowdy and tender, exaggerated and accurate, bruised and brave. If dime novels painted her in colors that didn't always match the weather, that is because posters must be seen from the far end of a street. Up close, she was the kind of person every hard place needs, a shoulder, a joke, a mule's competence with a softer bray. At night the cemetery's pines write their own psalms. Wind parts its hair around stone and says the syllables it has always said. Down in town, lights scatter like coins again. Someone tells a story about calamity that begins with swearing and ends with a blessing. Is the correct order. From Jane's bench, because every legend leaves behind a bench where the next traveler can rest. We watch a new figure ride in from the Indian Territory, wearing a star that fit as if it had been measured by Justice herself. Bass Reeves, tall, silent when silence handled the job. Thunder when thunder was the only grammar the day would accept. The Arkansas River keeps its own counsel. Brown water folds around sandbars, willows whisper to each other in a grammar older than maps. In that country a child is born 1838 by some ledgers, Crawford County by others. Pass. A name short enough to ride and strong enough to lift. He arrives into bondage, into a world arranged by other men's signatures. Chores measured in sunrise and permission. Tools pass hand to hand with the care a person gives another person as property. When he is the property, growing is a quiet business when a boy understands that silence is safer than the noise. He feels inside his bones. He learns hands how to mend a harness until leather stops remembering where it tore. How to read a horse's ears and a mule's opinions. How to listen for weather and the break between a bird's to notes. The frontier teaches languages by necessity, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole camps are neighbors more permanent than fences. Bass learns words the way some men learn songs at fires, at trading posts, at river crossings where a shared rope makes grammar simpler, or comes walking in other men's boots. A master points the way south and calls it duty. Camps move. Flags talk at each other across fields. Bass keeps learning even while the world unlearns peace. There is a story about a card game and a fist and the sudden knowledge that a man's life is larger than the room he is in. Whether the story happened exactly as told is less important than the fact that Bass left. Night. River. Indian Territory opening like a door he had earned. Among the nations he is not a stranger for long. He hunts with hunters who judge a man by how he lifts meat and carries it home. He learns to say thank you in more than one language and to show it in the universal one work. He marries. He plants things that answer back with food. He makes a house that remembers laughter. When emancipation arrives, it is not a trumpet for everyone. For some it is a letter that took too long. For Bass it is a confirmation of a decision he has already been making. With each mile walked free, he is not loud. He is exact. His rifle is a promise kept only when no other promise will hold. His hands are steady enough to split a playing card with a shot, and gentle enough to settle a skittish cold without reminding it who is stronger. There's news from back east of a judge, with a wide docket and a wider reputation. Fort Smith, Indian Territory. Bench that needs men to make the paper mean something between the lines. Bass listens. He rolls the thought like a cartridge between finger and thumb. He does not say yes quickly. He understands that a badge is not decoration. It is a contract with the night. In the small hours he imagines walking into camps where men will prefer their own explanations. He imagines speaking to them in the tones of their mothers and the tenses of the weather, asking for surrender without insult and offering a ride back that costs less than a shot would. He says yes. He is measured for a star. He prays in his own way, which is to say he checks his tack twice and kisses his wife's forehead and tells his children that he will bring stories home if stories behave. The Deputy U.S. Marshal of Indian Territory, bench nicknamed hanging by newspapers that enjoy headlines, warrants that smell like fresh ink and rain, a horse that will learn the way to Fort Smith and back by heart. The star sits easy on Bass's vest, not because it is light, but because he knows how to carry weight without making it wobble. Judge Parker's court issues paper that turns into miles. Deputy marshals fan out white, black, mixed blood, a ledger of names more varied than the newspapers remember later. Bass rides with reds tucked where rain can't find them. Each name is a conversation waiting to be had. Each path is a sentence that can end in period or question mark, or silence if a man insists on being a bad editor of his own day. He does not hurry into camps. He arrives as if he were expected. He talks before he does arithmetic. He lets a man save a part of his face if that will save the man as life. When talk fails, he is exact. He moves with the economy learned from men who do not waste cartridges or adjectives. If a shot must be fired, it is fired once. He writes the report without drama and with enough detail that the paper can bear the weight of. What happened? Stories grow around him like shade trees. That he once handcuffed 2 men while pretending to be a weary traveler and cooked them breakfast. Before revealing their risks were already agreed with the law. That he walked into a cabin wearing a farmer's hat and a patient frown, and walked out with the wanted man, everyone's dignity mostly intact. That he could track a tired horse by the way its prince apologized to the mud. He uses disguises not to trick for sport but to ask danger to show itself on terms. That end with all the living still living. A brim pulled low, a coat a touch too big. A limp that asks for a chair near the fire where the door is, so that when the door opens the conversation is already close to finished. He rides in all weathers. Ice on the river makes the horse think twice and pass only once. Summer dust turns his coat into the color of the day and he lets it. Night adds miles where paperwork subtracts them. He works with possemen who learn what silence is for. He teaches with a lifted chin rather than a lifted finger. He pays informants fairly and does not spend their names in saloons where whiskey listens. Violence happens. He does not invite it, but it arrives with eyes he does not recognize as negotiable. He meets it with the accuracy a good life deserves. 14 men by one count fall to his defense over decades. Fewer by others. Whatever the number, Bass sleeps with the knowledge that alternatives were offered first. He brings in thousands alive. He pairs iron with conversation and finds that conversation weighs less and carries farther. The nations are large and the work is larger, but the ledger grows on the good side of the page because a man who knows 3 languages of peace and 1 of war prefers to speak the first 3. In Fort Smith, the jail smells like men remembering their manners. The clerk learns to leave extra space in the book on days Bass rides in because paper runs short when a man keeps his promises so often. He does not drink. He does not boast. He plays a little fiddle for children in camps where the law has shaken tents and then made them still again. He sends home money and stories in the same envelope. Some paper elsewhere prints the word legend. Bass does not see it that week. He is out past Weber's Falls at a crossing where the water is speaking quick and a warrant is speaking quicker. Hard cases and the cost of being fair. A door opens to a kitchen where supper is half done and a man chooses to come in. Without being asked twice, a son's name on a warrant. A badge that weighs what it says it weighs. Some arrests become stories. Some become lodestones in a man's pocket. There's a kitchen door in a cabin somewhere near the bend in a small river. Bass knocks with the back of his knuckles. Way a neighbor does. Inside, a wanted man pauses at the sound the way a rabbit pauses at a hawk's shadow. Bass enters, hat in hand, words first. He smells beans and wood smoke and hears a child breathing in another room. He pitches his voice for quiet ears, names, papers. The offer of cuffs that do not bite if a man will not. The man looks at the floor, at the window, at the space beside Bass and the space behind himself. His shoulders let go. He nods. Day folds without blood. Another time he sits at a table for hours holding a conversation with a door waiting for it to admit someone who thinks night is taller than law. When the latch lifts, Bass lifts too, and the conversation ends as if it had been friendly all along. And then there is the warrant with a family name, his son. A bad night, a wife fallen, anger that imagined itself aloud. The paper does not tremble because paper never does. Bass's hand does not either, because a badge does not weigh less when it leans toward a house, you know. He saddles quietly. He prays in his way. That the day will be honest. At the door his son sees his father and a marshal. Both are true. Bass cuffs him with the same gentleness he offers strangers who do not argue and the same firmness he offers strangers who do. He escorts him to the place where days are counted by rules and then visits as a father visits. When visiting is all that is permitted, the community watches the scene from many angles. Some find it harsh. Some find it holy. Bass does not invite votes. He sleeps that night with the slow breath of a man who has paid the price the job asked, and did not borrow more for show. Hard cases multiply because the territory is busy with men who do not like to be told things. Bass meets them with a patience that makes itself felt before it is seen. He ties his horse where a man can watch the knot and understand it is not an insult but a forecast. He does not rush a breach, he knocks. He calls a name in the language that name was given in and waits to be answered like a man waiting. At his own table, when bullets come anyway, he returns them to the senders in the shortest route available. Report writing afterward is a kind of mercy, clean sentences, no embroidery. Respect paid to facts because facts are the only thing a widow can stand to read. Without feeling swindled, ears make their own weather in a body, dust rights in lungs, saddles right in backs. But Bass keeps his seat in its center. He prays with deeds, which is the religion the road. Understands, he teaches younger possemen the arithmetic of range. How far a man can run after adrenaline leaves and regret arrives. How much water a prisoner needs to drink to make the trip home. Feel like a promise kept by both sides. How a look can say yes faster than a pistol can say no. Statehood, a new beat, and the long fade of a tall horse. Territory becomes state. Federal papers change their letterhead. Veteran with a star takes a city post where boots wear out slower, but hearts sometimes do not. Oklahoma steps into statehood wearing a suit that will need tailoring. Courts rearrange themselves like furniture after a move. Deputy marshals lose a home and find jobs in new rooms. Bass does not retire into a rocking chair as myth would have him do. He becomes a policeman in Muskogee, a beat, a nightstick where a Winchester used to ride, the same eyes. City work is a different conversation with trouble, less distance, more repetition. Names on corners instead of creeks. He moves through streets lit by lamps that imagine themselves reliable. He tips his hat to shopkeepers who remember being afraid of dust storms and are now afraid of taxes. He guides drunks home with the dignity allowed in a town that wants to be won. He separates quarrels with the understanding that some men only need a minute to discover they were wrong. Youths test him and find him not yet a relic. He turns hands that thought they were fists into hands that are again pockets. He turns arguments into errands. Go fetch your mother, go fetch your boss, go fetch your better sense and bring it back before morning. Illness begins to make appointments he cannot ignore, sugar in the blood that sweetens nothing. Legs that asked for chairs earlier in the day, he concedes enough to keep working well and no more. Colleagues half his age watch him and adjust their own spines. They learn that authority does not. Apt to shout and that courtesy can carry a night farther than swagger. He hangs the belt up when his body insists. He does it without speeches, which is how he did most things. He keeps a chair by a window and watches weather return to its appointed rounds. Children and grandchildren hear stories that do not boast and learn to read the spaces between sentences for the parts a man chooses not to throw like shade at his own past. In 1910, breath slows. The room learns to be still. The window keeps doing its work of bringing the outside in. Bass Reeves' day ends the way his days began, with attention paid and noise kept to what was necessary. Legend, ledger, and the transfer of the road. What remains when the horse is unsaddled for good? What rumors do with a name? What the law keeps when it learns to honor someone quieter than his headlines? Where good life ends, rooms keep a little of the voice that used to speak there. A hat hangs on a peg with more purpose than the wood can explain. A badge in a drawer behaves itself. The papers add him to their long ledgers, the obituaries that measure a republic's memory. He fills more columns than men who shouted louder. He earns lines that speak of thousands arrested. Of a handful killed only when necessity performed its stubborn duty. A man who did not drink his courage but banked it. Stories argue afterward about the Lone Ranger, whether some popular mask borrowed its shape from a black deputy who rode without one. Some say yes and list the similarities like beads. Some say the beads do not make a rosary. Bass, who never asked for applause to be accurate, would likely smile and let storytellers enjoy their work if it brought respect for real deeds. But as sure as this, he proved a badge can fit any man who pays for it with stamina and fairness. He proved language can be a bridge wide enough for a fugitive to walk back over. He proved that the best kind of fear a lawman inspires is the fear of disappointing a decent man. In Fort Smith and Muskogee and a dozen smaller places where ledger ink ran before rivers did, his name sits easy on tongues now. Statues appear in parks that learn to spell his last name with pride. Schools tell children that heroes can be quiet. For along ASMR Road passes a wide, calm mile. He slows the cadence after gunfighter headlines. He prepares the air for a different register of noise. The clatter of a train, the Pinkertons' telegraph clicks. Rhythm of hooves beside rails where men like Jesse James tested timetables for weaknesses. From here we turn to a figure who read Reconstruction as an insult and made the railroads pay for it. In a currency he called justice and others called theft. His name rode newspapers even when he didn't ride that day. His legend learned to rob with a flourish and a mask of its own. Jesse James' brother. Guerrilla before he was a robber. Headline before he was a history lesson. Let your breath stay slow. We will not give him more music than he deserves. But we will put him in the procession where he belongs after a lawman whose shadow falls long and useful across the page. The Missouri woods can look peaceful from a porch. Corn rows. Creeks shine. Mule thinking out loud before it agrees to pull. Clay County held all of that, and the other thing too, lines on a map that behaved like open wounds. Before the war, James was just a family name that fit on a mailbox. Bert, a Baptist minister with a voice shaped for sermons. Zerelda, sharp-eyed and unafraid to ask the day for more. Frank Holder, bookish, and Jesse, the younger. Quick to horses, quicker to pride. Then Bleeding Kansas taught neighborhoods the vocabulary of enemies. Ann argued politics and practiced with pistols. Barnes learned the sound of strangers after dark. Boys listen, they don't always understand, but they memorize tone when war came proper. Flags multiplied like weather vanes. Guerrillas rode the creeks and fence lines. Quantrill's band and other bands that used names like saddles, tools for a distance they intended to cover. Frank slipped into that current first. Jesse followed the way younger brothers do, with a look that asks for permission and a set of the jaw that says permission isn't the final vote. Touch stories of a whipping and a rope and Union militia demanding answers of boy didn't he have. Jaw other stories with different accents. What the stories agree on is this. By his late teens, Jesse was a horse on fire pointed at the dark. He learned the ugly arts of bush war, the close work, the fast ride, the hard decision that does not wait for dawn. He rode under men whose names the land says softly even now, Anderson with its trail of ash. Commands that preferred speed to mercy, hard smiles that confuse courage with appetite. In ambush light the world narrows to muzzle flash and hoof thud. Boy who should be learning the weight of seed learns instead the weight of a carbine. The war ended on paper before it ended in hearts. Surrender sign in roams far from creek bottoms left some riders still in the saddle, still angry. Still certain their side was not finished because pride doesn't like clocks. Jesse was shot near the end, a bullet that asked a young lung whether it wanted to continue. He lived. He lay up and healed in a cousin's house where a girl named Zerelda Mims. Read him scripture and looked at him the way daylight looks at a man who isn't sure he can stand in it anymore. Many lives might have folded into plows at that point, but revenge and romance are loud roommates. The rails were coming. Banks had learned how to keep money in tidy rooms. Newspapers had learned how to sell stories with pictures made of words. And Jesse had learned how to ride without asking permission. So the piece opened like a door that leads to another road. He stepped through carrying the war in his bones and a future in his posture that said, I will introduce myself. From guerrilla to outlaw. A bank with a clock. A letter to a friendly editor. Boy who likes speed learns what fame costs when it comes early and chooses to stay. First day light bank robbery Americans told around stoves as if it were a new kind of weather. Had Missouri dust on it, Liberty gets the credit sometimes. Gallatin gets the headlines. Memory prefers drama, the ledger prefers dates. What matters for our slow telling is the pattern. A clerk at a counter, hat slow, hands sure. A town square blinking at noon while a few men behave like night. At Gallatin, December 1869, a cashier falls. Some say Jesse mistook the man for someone from the war, a debt paid to a grave that would not balance the book. He and Frank leave hard hoof marks on cold streets and a story that will not stop talking. Enter John Newman Edwards, editor, evangelist of the lost cause, a man who could dress a paragraph and send it into the world confident it would make friends. He printed letters that wore Jesse's posture, flattering light on old grievances. Romance painted onto theft like sunlight painted onto dust. If the letters were not the outlaw's exact words, They were the exact echo the time wanted. Robin Hood with a southern accent, polite to ladies. Rough with banks, indifferent to the small print of harm, Jesse learned the utility of myth. He sent notes to papers the way a man sends flowers to himself under a pen name. He denied things loudly enough that denial worked like advertising. He married Zian 1874 cousin Comfort, confessor children to hold in the evenings when the day's noise had to be unlearned. Became coalesced around brothers and neighbors, names that shared suppers and saddles, James. Youngers. Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, men who liked the taste of wind and the feel of money rescued from boxes that had looked smug on shelves. They robbed banks in small towns where a horse could be everywhere at once and nowhere you could name a minute later. They rode hard and split faster. They spread guilt thin so that lawmen had to choose which direction to hate before supper. Jesse wore a frock coat well, spoke softly in parlors, practiced a gentleman's smile that asked for cookies instead of questions. It confused people the way thunder confuses dogs. The sound didn't match the sky. This is the moment when a life could lean toward quiet. It did not. Rails were learning speed. Trains carried more cash and less romance than banks. The gang turned their attention from counters to timetables. Headlines followed because trains give headline schedules and Pinkertons followed headlines. Because banks prefer bills counted in their own rooms, trains and Pinkertons. A track sabotaged at dusk. A lantern swung like punctuation. A farmhouse at Kearney lit by a blast that darkened a family. Forever. A train at speed breathes differently than a horse. Its lungs are iron and cold and promise. Stop it, and the promise belongs to whoever stands tallest beside the track. Adair, Iowa, 1873. By the timetables, a curve, a pull, rails loosen where prudence would have tightened them. Cars tilt, passengers stagger, men with bananas make suggestions. The load is less than the risk deserved, but the practice session teaches lessons the gang applies in Missouri and beyond. Gads Hill, January 74. A flag waved like theater. Passengers relieved of watches that will tick their way into column inches later. Jesse is careful. With ladies, careful with the words. Careless with the idea that none of this will arrive at a reckoning. Reckonings investigate slowly. Then suddenly Alan Pinkerton's men, private law and government suits, start stitching together roads and nights. Until a pattern points toward a farmhouse outside Kearney. On a winter evening in 1875, they come with a plan and leave with a tragedy. Press will hold like a hot pan. A device through a window. A blast no house deserves. Cyril to Jesse's mother loses part of her right arm. Half-brother Archie, a boy made of mornings, does not wake again. The nation chooses a side for a few months. Pinkerton is the villain. Jesse is the headline that suddenly sounds like a defense attorney. Sympathy buys him time. Money buys him horses. Horses buy him distance. But distance does not always mean safety. The youngers sense the circle tightening. The Jameses do too, though Jesse treats the feeling as a dare rather than a warning. They rob more trains. Each job carries the echo of the house. The blast made by men paid to defend money becomes the wind behind robberies done by men who feel defended by the public as anger. It is a bad mathematics, but it explains a season. Warrants multiply. Rewards stiffen. Pinkertons learn, and sheriffs who have been patient for the sake of their own sleep begin to practice impatience. Jesse looks north, far beyond the familiar counties and their family trees, toward a town in Minnesota that has never heard his name spoken by a neighbor. He makes a plan that assumes surprise is a kind of armor. It will be the last plan of that size he ever enjoys. Northfield, bright noon, bank that refuses the script, a town that says no out loud, brothers in the street with the wrong math on their side. September 1876, Northfield, Minnesota wears early autumn like a fresh shirt. College town calm. Windows that trust the day. Into this innocence ride strangers with coats too long for the weather and hats pulled low enough to insult. Two men step into the First National Bank with the kind of smile that apologizes in advance. Others idle in the street, pretending horse talk. Inside, Cashier Joseph Lee Haywood answers a gun with the one tool he has that matters, refusal. He says the safe is on a time lock when perhaps it isn't. He will not open it. He will not help. Outside, townspeople look twice, then a third time, and decide together without a meeting that their street belongs to them. Fire from windows. Shots from behind barrels. A shout that means we have agreed. The robbers in the bank flinch into anger, into the kind of art that walks beside men forever afterward, whether they outlive it or not. Wood dies. The town does not back down. Horses shy in sudden noise. The street turns narrow for men who needed it to be wide. Strangers become targets, become wounded, become desperate. Flight follows chaos through cornfields. Creeks that don't agree to stand aside. Posse after posse like ripples chasing a thrown stone. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, Bob, bleed their way south until distance runs out. They choose to stand. They fall, captured under a pile of consequence. Frank and Jesse do not fall that day. They separate from the wreckage like last leaves in a wind that chooses which trees to empty. They vanish toward Dakota, then farther, ghosted by sympathizers who can shelter but cannot restore. Northfield becomes a sermon the rest of the country clips and saves, that an armed town can say no, that a man behind a counter can weigh fear against duty and decide that a gang is not a season, only weather. For Jesse, the raid closes a door he had insisted was a hallway. He and Frank will live under names that fit badly. Families will try to be families around the edges of aliases. Work will change from the rush of a ride to the quiet arithmetic of not being seen. But hunger for the old noise is a habit, and restlessness is a particular gravity. Years pass, children grow, a move to Nashville under false colors, a return to Missouri when false colors start to itch, a fresh gang, young men eager for proximity to a legend that can sign the air with a promise of money, and leave the bill on the table for their nerves to pay. Pair of brothers among them Ford, Charles and Robert, faces the newspapers will remember because newspapers like ironies, and rooms like stagecraft. St. Joseph, a picture on a wall in the quiet after a shot. A rented house, a morning chore, shoes not yet dusted, a Legends Inn performed in a room too small for dignity. The rented frame house on Lafayette Street looks ordinary from the road, white paint trying hard. Fence that promises more privacy than it can deliver. Inside lives a man named Howard who is not. Z cooks, children radiate the arguments of breakfast. Jesse moves with the caution of someone who has taught himself to be domestic without entirely believing the lesson will hold. He has new plans because old habits pay in familiar currency, one of them good. A small bank downriver, a timetable, the last rehearsal for a song the country is tired of hearing and will continue to hum after the singer is gone. The four brothers share the room and the future it implies they are nervy in, flattered by their proximity to fame. They are also practical in a way that carries the smell of bargains. April 3rd, 1882. Morning light on cheap wallpaper. Heat starting to think about the day. Jesse takes off his guns because the children are in the room, a domestic sentence that will be repeated for 100 years as if it explains everything and nothing. He steps on a chair to straighten a picture. Behind him, Bert Ford raises a pistol with a hand steadier than his heart and steadier than his honor. A shot snaps the room closed. Cards flutter at Deadwood in the country's imagination in St. Joseph, a man's that falls and does not look useful anymore. Z screams away air screams when fire takes it. Children become statues because statues are the only safe thing to be. Charlie Ford tries to manage the aftermath and cannot. Neighbors rush, reporters hustle. History begins its busy work. The reward is claimed. Public feeling does its complicated dance, some relieved, some disgusted, some both and unwilling to select. Robert Ford tours with the story like a dark salesman and finds that applause curdles when it gets close to betrayal. Charlie will not travel long. His road shortens. Frank surrenders with a sadness the papers cannot measure. Trials, acquittal. Later quiet. He will outlast the weather that made his first life possible. She keeps a house where memory walks in without knocking. She bears children past the point where budget considers itself a partner. She lives long enough to sit beside the grave and say words the newspapers will never record, because they are not for anyone else. What remains? A legend handed around like a coin, the image worn smooth on the good luck side, the scar on the other face, a wardrobe of masks, hero to some, criminal to others, restless boy to a few who saw him before history put him on a poster. For our long, gentle series, we keep the breath even. We honor the victims whose names the headlines skimp. We acknowledge the press that loved its own stories. We nod to the mother, the wife, the children who held long nights upright while men made noise. And We hand the road to the man who rode beside Jesse almost always, who bled in Minnesota and paid with years, who told his part plain after the shouting quieted. Cole Younger, another chair by another window, another ledger with columns labeled choice and consequence and the long, slow math that comes after. Missouri mornings are generous with dew. Fence posts drink it. Corn leaves hold it like a promise. Thomas Coleman Younger, Cole learned those mornings first. These summit country ridges that made horizon a repeated thought, a house where work arrived before breakfast and stayed past supper. A father who rode with purpose and politics both. A mother who kept the center even when the outside tried to shout. Sisters who could do sums and chores. Brothers who could swap tools without swapping tempers. Neighbors were divided not by fences but by senses. Kansas to the west, slavery and union and the new nation's unfinished argument breathing hot through hedgerows. Before war had uniforms, it had visits after dark. Men on horses with faces for masks. Barn doors that remembered knocks no one taught them. Cole watched pride and insult learn each other's names. He learned a boy's math for danger. How voices flatten when men mean it. How the dog's bark carries notes only horses understand. His father was beaten once, the sort of beating that teaches a family to store its papers in more than one place. His stepfather, the last man of the house for a season, was shot. Homespun law began to feel like no law at all. By the time uniforms arrived, they fit poorly on old grudges. Quantrill's writers made a grammar for the border where adjectives were bullets and verbs arrived on fast horses. Frank James joined first. Cole followed, not because he loved blood, but because hatred had become a neighborhood and he had learned the address by heart. He rode, he scouted, he argued with himself and lost in the way young men lose to momentum. But war's close work is not the stuff of lullabies. We will not paint it pretty. We will only speak it softly and straight. There was a day at Lawrence when fire learned to pronounce men's names. Columns became ash. Mothers wrote lists with shaking hands and no ink. Cole was there by his own later account, or near enough that the truth still kicks when touched. The border turned its face away and still saw it. Men rode back through creeks that did not want to carry that kind of story. Some prayed, some drank, some decided prayer would be their drink. Kept writing because stopping looked too much like admitting something to himself he was not ready to hear. He grew hard in the way a man hardens when forgiveness is not in the local vocabulary. He learned to live on the distance between a trigger and a thought. He learned to leave quickly and arrive without a sound. When papers back east said the war was over, the hedgerows disagreed. Cold peace came without a plan for what to do with hands that had learned one job too well. A suit pulled over a rider's bones, a bank counter that looks like an enemy wearing wood. A letter to a friendly editor who understands how to make smoke look like perfume. Reconstruction arrived like a stranger with rules. Loyalty oaths, new sheriffs. Old neighbors deputized by papers posted crooked on courthouse doors. Cole tried wearing town clothes. They buttoned. They did not suit. Horses snorted at the idea of retirement. Frank and Jesse wrote one version of the next chapter. Cole's page is inked in the same hand. They were men who could pass in a parlor and disappear in a thicket. They looked like Sunday and rode like Saturday night. Banks were symbols as much as safes. Counters were men who had never smelled powder held other men's mortgages like reins, the first. Breeze were part vengeance, part theater, part hunger with a pistol. Gallatin, Richmond, Lexington. Place names like pegs on a map where a coat might hang for an hour and ride on. Cole's gift was steadiness. He did not talk loud. He arranged. He judged the street the way a soldier judges a field. For places that will change their minds at noon, John Newman Edwards printed the legend with eager type, letters that excused, adjectives that polished, paragraphs that lifted crimes into cusses with a magician's handkerchief. Cole did not write the copy. He appreciated the lighting. He did not mind that the playbill kept names like his in smaller font when Jesse S. drew the crowd. Money splits are conversations. Risk is arithmetic. He understood both. Trains replaced banks in the gang's appetite. Steel carried schedules. Schedules allowed rehearsals. Cole rode point or guard, kept the timing, measured the panic. Left ladies unsearched on purpose when purpose allowed. He loved his family with a kind of awkward sincerity. Men in hard trade save for kitchens. Letters folded small. Visits shorter than pies deserved. Gifts bought in towns that didn't know the money's first name. The Pinkertons grew teeth. A winter night at household a lesson about justice unmoored, a blast, a boy lost, a mother maimed. Grief changed the temperature of the room for years. Cole carried that heat and cooled it with distance. He considered laying down the road. The road considered him and shook its head. Newspapers chanted his name and others in rhythms the country began to hum without listening. Young men arrived with eyes that wanted a reputation to borrow. Old friends wore out. The circle strained. Minnesota lay far enough away to feel safe for a plan. But just to say it was far enough away that the map could lie. Northfield beckons, a clean Main. Street, a bank with daylight on the counter, a town with its own arithmetic. Distance is a poor substitute for surprise, but men in motion trusted. Northfield looked like a place that would not shout. College boys with neat collars. Merchants who knew each other's dogs. Bank with a safe that sat like a choir loft behind railings more decorative than defensive. Cole helped plan. The gang split roles like chores. Inside men, outside men. A street orchestra tuned for a noon performance of theft. They rode in with coats that didn't match the weather, hats whose brims worked too hard at humility. Horses breathed the question no one asked aloud. Are you certain? Inside, words sharpened into orders. Haywood's refusal was a door that would not open. Cole wasn't there in the vault room. He was on the street where angles argue. But the sound of refusal can be heard through walls. It travels down a man's spine and into his next decision outside. Northfield refused to be a stage. Clerks became riflemen. Students became sentries. A blacksmith became an obstacle. Opinions cannot move. Shots traded like unkind neighbors. Horses screamed that hoarse scream that makes even men who love noise wish for quiet. Cole took a ball before the day agreed to end. Flesh that had been practiced at not complaining had to sit down. He kept men moving anyway, out of town, into fields away from windows that had learned to aim. The ride south was a geography of exhaustion. Creeks that thought they were borders. Corn that hid nothing well enough. Blood that marked trails like poor advice. At Hanskasluff near Modelia, the younger brother's luck and strength both ran out. Osman closed in like sentences closing around a name. Cole shot up and still bargaining for breath, called out terms because dying is poor negotiation, but so is arrogance. He would not quit on pride. He would not trade his brothers for a clean shirt. He raised a white scrap that used to be something else and made it mean truce. Captured, carried, stitched with rough thread. He looked up at a ceiling that did not belong to him and began a next life, still water. Stone walls, clocks that do not forget. Years that write themselves even when a man would rather write something else. Prison is a schedule. It reduces a man to repetition and then asks what he can build from it. At Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater, Cole exchanged gallops for corridors. He counted time in work whistles and chapel bells. He learned to make chairs that did not wobble, and sentences that didn't either. Bob and Jim were there too, brothers with the same ledger. Columns filled by one terrible afternoon and the hours that made it likely. Cole read. He read the Bible without hurrying and found the parts that refused to be theatrical. He read newspapers when they let him and learned how small his own name looked set among other men as small names. He wrote letters steady as fence posts, regret without begging, hope without salesmanship. Visitors came, clergy, curious men with notebooks, old neighbors who spoke through bars like they were speaking through winter. Cole treated each as a chance to be accurate. He did not decorate his past. He did not ask the future to put on makeup. Years have a weight even iron respects. Bob died inside. Jim endured, bitter and tender by turns, proving that a heart can hold both without splitting. Pardon petitions rose and fell like wheat. Governors changed. Public mood changed. Cole changed too. But slowly, like with seasons, Pearl arrived in 1901 like a careful spring. Pages were signed. Doors worked a new way for him. The sky outside tasted like an old song remembered. Conditions were strict and made sense. Minnesota would watch. Cole would walk straight. He kept the bargain. The road again, but different. A Wild West show with an honest title. A book written plainly. And on a platform telling boys that some roads go where you think and some don't tea. And that he recommends the first kind from experience. Freedom after Longstone is a new kind of work. You must learn to turn without hearing keys. You must sleep without needing to practice waking to footsteps. Cole went on the road with old friend and old opponent Frank James, the great Cole Younger and Frank James' historical Wild West, a title that did not lie about the past and tried not to sell the future too hard. They did not glorify. They demonstrated. They showed horsemanship and spoke about consequence. They earned money the way showmen do and endured the way old comrades do, with jokes that cover more than they reveal. He also joined church circles, talked temperance with the voice of a man who had learned what whiskey does to judgment that already has too much history to carry. He said he had been converted, which meant he had decided to be useful to Rome's with children in them. In 1903, he published the story of Cole Younger by himself. No purple prose, just a ledger, balanced as best he could with notes in the margin that say, "This was wrong, I did it, I am trying to be a different man now." He visited Minnesota towns when the air remembered him and behaved. He thanked officers who had arrested him for doing it clean. He tipped his hat to graves. He did not try to collect sympathy like coins. He spent courtesy like water. Late years in Lee's Summit were quiet, a garden. Old neighbors who decided at last to talk about weather instead of history. A chair on a porch where dusk arrives in work clothes. He died in 1916 with enough breath left to be gentle to people arranging papers. His stone is simple because simplicity suits what he tried to become. What do we keep? Boy pushed by a boarder, into a saddle too soon, a man who made terrible choices at speed, a prisoner who learned to slow down, a citizen who stood up in Rome's and said the sentence the young need from old Miles, "Don't do as I did, do as I wish I had done." For a long road, Cole S. Bench sits between Jesse S. Noyes and a quieter figure the dime novels called a queen and the court filings called a defendant. Belle Starr, a woman who braided outlawry with hospitality, wore a hat better than most men, and left a trail of Romer and family through the river bottoms of Indian Territory. Before she was a poster, she was a girl with ink on her fingers. Myra Maybelle Shirley, May to some. Belle later to most, grew under Missouri sky that practiced being dramatic. Storms rehearsed in the distance, then arrived polite as callers, a clap at the door, a gust like a greeting. Her father kept delivery and a notion of gentility. Her mother kept the arithmetic of a household that entertained more travelers than it could afford, and yet somehow managed it. Books lived in that house. A piano too, keys dusted like promises. Mira's hands knew reins and scales. She learned to sit straight in a dress and to sit straighter on a horse. The border was already learning to argue with itself. Kansas to the west, Missouri to the east. Men who preferred neighbors in theory and practiced enemies in fact. Frank and Jesse James were boys not terribly far away, youngers too. Names that would grow larger later were just syllables then. Word didn't knock, it moved in. Families shifted like furniture. The Shirleys went south for a time, Texas dust on trunks that once thought they were ornamental. On the road, Myra learned the patience of miles and the sharpness of being stared at, for wearing confidence like a hat. In Dallas, she caught the light the way certain people do without asking it to follow them. A good seat on a side saddle, a calm hand with a spirited horse, eyes that measured roans before roans decided what to think of her. Men admired, women appraised. Myra learned to let both glances pass through her without taking her balance. To the war, the road turned back north. Fields repaired themselves reluctantly. People did so more slowly. She married a man who had ridden hard in bad years, James Reed, Jim when the day was soft. Reed when the day required emphasis. He could be charming like a porch at evening, or dangerous like a door in a wind you should have seen coming. Together they tried ordinary for a while, farming, a baby, a kitchen where steam hung like thin curtains. But ordinary had competitors, old grudges, quick money, roads that remember how to call names. Reed drifted toward robbery the way some men drift toward song, first as a listener, then as a participant. Myra knew. Woman knows the smell of risk when it sleeps in her house. She rode sometimes, not as a second, but as someone who expects the ground to be honest. She watched for dust that meant company, for riders who did not wave, for telegraph poles whose wires conducted more than messages, they conducted consequences. People noticed the hat first, then the way the woman under it did not apologize for being seen. They would later embroider her with feathers and lace in their imagination. In truth, she wore what traveled well and what announced, "I am comfortable being exactly here." When a name was needed, for posters, for headlines, for the legend that runs faster than a horse, Belle fit. Sharp at both ends, soft in the middle if you knew her. The Reed years and the first shadow of the bandit queen. How houses that want to be homes, roads that disagree, a shootout that decides for everyone what happens next. Ordinary tried, it really did. Chores, music on Sundays. A child practicing the shape of the word mama with serious concentration. But Ordinary had a rival called Appetite. Reed rode with men who measured evenings and coin counted on tables that also held pistols, cattle. Herds were math problems you could steal answers from if you had enough friends and not too many. Scruples. Belle's skill set fit a more complicated life than the one Ham imagined for her. She could handle a horse in crooked country. She could hold a secret without turning it into theater. She could sit in a room full of men and make the room mine itself. When the law narrowed, Reed widened. He stepped deeper into a stream that called itself opportunity and looked like water until it didn't. There were whispered affiliations, Younger's this. Dames is that, companionships braided by necessity more than design. Whether Belle rode to the edge of those deeds or only watched their dust, has kept pens busy ever since. What we know is this: by 1874 James Reed was too much the outlaw, and too little the husband for safety to continue. Near Paris, Texas, a lawman's bullet argued the matter to its conclusion. Reed went down. The headlines got paid. Belle became a widow with a baby on her hip and a reputation that had not asked her permission to ride. Widowhood makes some women small and some women exact. Belle became exact. She managed property that came and went like weather. She played cards well enough to pay for coffee and worse men's mistakes. She wore a pistol because nights are long in thin-walled rooms. Suitors appeared with good hats and bad timing. She considered each like a chess problem and declined most of them with a smile that did not require translation. Indian Territory drew her the way wide rooms draw people who dislike ceilings. The nations kept their own order and expected visitors to learn it quickly. There a figure named Sam Starr entered the story, Cherokee by blood, unimpressed by men who depended on posture, interested in a woman who could ride beside him without trying to outrun him for sport. Belle and Sam married under tribal forms in 1880. The homestead at Younger's Bend turned into a waypoint, a house that smelled like stew and horse sweat and a little bit of gun oil, where the door stayed open for certain travelers and shut itself for others. People came who needed a meal, a message carried, a warning given. People came who needed a place to be briefly unfindable. Belle sorted them without ceremony. The newspapers sharpened their pencils and their interest. Queen of the outlaws, one wrote with the laziness of monarchy. She was queen of nothing but her gate and her table still. The phrase stuck like burrs and rode everywhere with her name, Younger's Bend, Sam Starr. And a Marshall Knox, a river house where stew never runs out, a husband who keeps one eye on the door. Bass Reeves in the saddle with a writ that will not apologize. Indian Territory is a conversation between law and courtesy. If you speak both, you get invited to more rooms. Belle spoke both. She kept a table on purpose, bread, beans, coffee that made mornings walk straight. She also kept horses the way some keep jewelry, not ornamental, valuable. Sam Starr acted like a tree with roots and branches, steadfast at home, spreading news in unseen ways. He could be stern. He could be generous. He believed the nations should look after their own and that outsiders should do their work and leave. But the border is porous where money walks. Stolen horses complicate friendships faster than gossip does. Names made of aliases passed through. Some left tracks that fit warrants, some did not. Deputy U.S. Marshals from Fort Smith rode the territory like punctuation. Commas where a pause helped, periods where sentences refused to end. Among them was Bass Reeves, quiet and exact, a man whose star fit as if it had been cut from his own patience. One day, 1882, by many accounts, Bass Reeves arrived with papers that spoke in the simple grammar of accusation, horse theft. Not a grand charge, but the kind that binds. Arrests are often more about decorum than force. Reeves knew this. Belle did too. She did not play queen in that moment. She played host to the facts. At Fort Smith, Judge Parker's court did the arithmetic. 9 months for Belle at the Detroit House of Corrections, a sentence that sounded like a winter and felt like a long rain. Sam took his portion too. Prison turned some people brittle. It turned Belle exact again. She learned a routine well enough to make it behave. She folded time into letters and into plans for the gate at Younger's Bend. When she returned, the river sounded different because she did. She kept the house open but tightened its rules. Horses were counted with more suspicion and less. Poetry, guests were received like weather, welcome when needed, resisted when not. She wore a tailored habit and a hat with a brim that understood arithmetic. She rode armed, but not flamboyantly. She kept the door's threshold cleaner than the papers said she did. And her prison Sam's last day, Belle's many stories, and the price of a name, a quarrel by a fence line, a shot that makes a widow twice, posters that refuse to retire. Sam Starr died the way men with reputation sometimes do, not in a grand raid, but in an argument that misjudged distance. A neighbor named Frank West, a quarrel over horses or pride depending on who is telling it. A sudden noise that made every other sound in the bottom seem far away for a while. Belle buried him with the exactness she brought to everything. She stood straight. She accepted dishes from neighbors who knew that casserole is a language grief understands. She did not retire into veils. She rode. Posters kept their jobs. Bandit Queen inked by men who had never shared her table, who liked the silhouette of a woman with a pistol because it solved layout problems. She obliged just enough to get paid for appearances when money asked politely. She told stories in tents. And tents would listen and fed people in kitchens when kitchens needed a boss. Suitors came again. Some more charm like ill-fitting coats, some more trouble like perfume. She considered them all and chose a few briefly alliances of convenience. Companionships with expiration dates. Jim, July Star, Cherokee, and Younger stood near her in those years as roomer and partner by turns. Edgar Watson, a neighbor with a temper that did math too quickly, became another orbiting name. Bass Reeves rode through the story again now and then, not always to our door, but close enough that the law remained a part of the landscape rather than a remote weather report. She respected that. She kept to her arithmetic. Food, animals, children when they visited, men when they behaved. The legend machine did its own accounting. Dime novels ironed out contradictions. Newspapers preferred hats and pistols to ledgers and gates. Photographers caught her in studio light. That made the territory look tidy. She smiled a little sometimes, because a little smile spins better than a large one. Under the wardrobe of reputation lived a person with daily concerns, broken rails on a fence, chickens that refused logic, a river that asked for respect in flood season and drought both. The Bend, a birthday and a shot without a witness, a February morning, a road cut through trees, an ending that left more questions so the posters would have work later. February 3rd, 1889. Belle rode home from a neighbor's, a short distance that rain can make long if it chooses. 41 years old by the arithmetic she used. A birthday. On the road near the homestead, the woods held their breath. A shot, then another. A woman in a riding skirt becoming suddenly still in a way that made the ground remember the day for a long time. Who? Dead men and living suspects offer poor testimony. Some said Jim July, friend and rival in ways that complicate sentences. Some said Edgar Watson, a neighbor with grudges that did push-ups in the dark. Some said family, because families are the only things that know enough to confuse the record properly. No jury put a period on it. Case remained a comma in a book that closed itself. Neighbors carried her. Children cried the way children do when an adult has been myth for them and mother enough for someone else and they are allowed both truths at once. The nations murmured their ceremonies. The river wrapped the sound and kept it. Posters got their final image without earning it. Papers wrote fast. Dime novels moved their commas around and sold more copies. But kitchens remembered other details. That Belle Starr kept too hot for men whose names deserved paper and men whose names didn't. That she counted horses like a rancher and not like a thief. And every counting was hers to command, that she treated children with a firmness that meant love, and a humor that meant the same. What do we keep at bedtime when the noise is done? Woman who refused to be reduced, not to queen, not to villain, not to saint. She was a manager of thresholds in a time and place that turned thresholds into stages. If we need a picture, keep this one, a gated Younger's Bend, hinges oiled, coffee on, a rider dismounting with stories in his pockets and Belle deciding with a glance and a nod which of those stories may enter the room. From Belle's table, our trail turns toward a man who learned gunplay early, kept ledgers of enemies. But a sad last chapter in an El Paso saloon when the century decided to tidy up. John Wesley Hardin, fast, proud, complicated. We will slow our breath and meet him gently. Morning in high desert is a slow kindness. Sage wakes first, then the fence posts, then the voices in a bunkhouse deciding who will boil coffee and who will pretend to argue about it. But Leroy Parker opened his eyes into that world, 1866 Beaver, Utah Territory, son of Mormon settlers who measure days in chores and miles. A big family, quiet hopes, scripture on Sundays and saddle leather the rest. He was a good hand early, cold gentle, chore honest, with a smile that arrived before defenses did. Work took him to dairy sheds and line camps, then to ranches farther out where a boy can try on the size of the horizon without anyone. Laughing in his travels, he crossed paths with a cowboy named Mike Cassidy, older, handy with horses, handy with mischief. Unimpressed by men who took themselves too seriously, Robert admired the competence, the posture, the way the men treated animals as partners, names or tools on the frontier. Sometimes you sharpen one, sometimes you borrow one. Robert kept Cassidy tucked in his pocket like a lucky coin. The Butch followed later, perhaps from a stint in a butcher's shop in Rock Springs. Perhaps because the nickname fit the mouth and the town remembered it. As a young wrangler, he learned the unglamorous skills that make later headlines possible, shoeing a nervous horse without insulting it, wrapping a rope that won't betray you at speed, finding water by reading what the grass refuses to say aloud. He also learned kindness, not the sentimental kind, just the useful kind. Patch a saddle for a man whose hands shook, share a patrol when the wind forgets its manners. Leave a gate the way you found it even when no one is watching. First trouble came small, a pair of jeans taken on credit from a closed general store. Paid back later with a note and a grin. Then larger, cold swapped, brands blurred by convenience more than malice. Butch was a gentle outlaw in these early pages, not violent for sport, not eager to scare children. He preferred jokes to gunsmoke and would spend an extra minute staging a scene so that the man in front of the gun could keep a little dignity while handing over the cash. He drifted east and north, Wyoming sheep country, Montana's big, clean distances, Idaho's river cuts, picking up friends who liked long rides and long odds. They were not yet the wild bunch. They were just a set of riders who could find each other by the sound of a laugh in a crowded room. Camps learned to relax when Butch arrived. Cards were cleaner. Fights ended sooner. He disliked useless meanness and had a gift for reminding men that tomorrow would require the same faces to share the same coffee. There was jail. Briefly, Laramie time for horseflesh confusion, months that taught him the value of enduring, and the value of promising himself not to return. He came out with a resolution that looked like a joke until it didn't. If he robbed, he'd do it cleverly. If he ran, he'd run far. He would try very hard not to add funerals to the ledger. He found a natural fortress to match that temperament. Hole in the wall, a red rock notch in Wyoming that folds into hidden parks like a magician's scarf. There, with caches of grain and lookouts who could count a posse a half day away, Butch built a clubhouse out of stone and mutual regard. Riders came and went. Plans were tested against maps and meals. A code developed, a light one, more courtesy than constitution, no hurting women or children, no senseless shooting, no stealing a horse a neighbor might need to get home unless you plan to leave a better one in its place. The century turned silly, rails snaked, payrolls grew heavier, Pinkertons wired farther, and a young woman with steady eyes would soon enter the picture to suggest that charm can be a strategy and a refuge at the same time. For now we stand with a boy who borrowed a name and made it fit. Robert became Butch softly, but without slamming any doors behind him. He carries the new head like it's already broken in. Hole in the wall to Castlegate crew making, timetable math, and a photograph that would travel, a payroll, wagon on a narrow road, an engineer who understands persuasion. If Fort Worth studio where 5 men sit too still and accidentally become permanent. Plans are slower than gunshots and more powerful in the long run. Butch preferred plans. He gathered men who could think and men who could ride. Harry Alonzo Longaball, who would become the Sundance Kid when a magistrate as record and a town as memory agreed. Harvey Logan called Kid Curry, quick to anger and quicker to accuracy when anger insisted. Will Carver, Ben Kilpatrick, Elsie Lay. Others who came in and out like weather. Castlegate robbery in 1897 looked simple on paper and stayed simple because the paper was right. A coal company payroll escorted by 2 men, a canyon road that offered introductions, Butch and Elsie in matching blue overalls that made them blend with miners. A few sentences spoken plainly, a hand open for the sack, a right away not hurry, just efficient. No shots, a story riddled with admiration even by the clerk later, because not being terrified is a kind of mercy. Butch tinkered with trains the way way some men tinker with watches and studied grades. Brakes, curves that force engineers to choose between prudence and pride, he preferred to separate. Engines from express cars complicate the problem for lawmen before it started. Telegraph lines went dark suddenly in sections of country that had enjoyed reliable gossip for months. Hole in the wall served as rehearsal space and retreat. At night, humor kept fear from multiplying. Sundance played cards like a mathematician playing patience. Kid. Curry scowled at rules and then followed Butch's anyway. Butch laughed easily, spoke gently, and saved stern voice for the few occasions it was required. Then came the photograph. Fort Worth, 1899, a city tired of pretending not to be amused by itself. 5 outlaws in suits, Butch, Sundance Kid, Curry, Will Carver, Ben Kilpatrick, sit for a portrait to entertain themselves and perhaps to entertain posterity. They looked like bankers about to approve their own loan. The plate traveled farther than any of them expected. Displayed in a window, noticed by a detective with a good memory for cheekbones, reproduced and mailed and pinned to walls in towns that had never heard of a hole in the wall but suddenly felt acquainted with it. Publicity offers to currencies, fame, and trouble. The wild bunch accepted both by accident and then learned to spend them carefully. Train robberies stepped up their production values. Wilcox, Wyoming, Union Pacific, no. Warner Bridge blown, express car isolated. Safe persuaded with explosives that made the night agree to tell stories later, tipped in two. Sometimes the money met expectations. Sometimes it didn't. Powdered charcoal faces in comical and inconvenient ways. Butch kept asking for cleverness over cruelty. Let the insurance companies pay. He liked to say in one version of the legend, not the passengers. And often that is how it went. Clerks were apologized to, ladies left alone. Engineers thanked for their patience. The Pinkerton agency filed its homework. Charles Siringo and colleagues trailed acquaintances, collected saddle shop receipts, made posies into posses. Posters learned to spell Cassidy and Longaball with confidence. And in the middle of this dance, at a place stepped from the wings a woman with poise, with a schoolteacher's posture and a traveler's passport. Friend, lover, wife to Sundance by some papers, companion to Butch and to the whole enterprise by spirit. She softened rooms and sharpened choices. She also reminded these men that the world contained parlor light as well as campfire light. The bunch could have scattered then. They did not. The last great season of American robberies played itself out across Wyoming, Utah, Colorado. But the circle was tightening. In photographs, men age all at once. In life it takes longer but feels the same. Wilcox to Winmucca powder burns, posse dust, and an elegance of escape payrolls on rails, a Nevada bank on a quiet morning. Horses standing like accomplices, Pinkerton's closer, but still insisting on the joke when a joke would save a nervous man his hands from shaking. Breeze-making headlines were not miracles, they were rehearsals performed at speed. Butch designed, Sundance executed like a metronome. Kid Curry insured against errors with a willingness to be the storm if necessary. Wilcox, 1,899, a concealed charge, a rail broken as if by accident. The train halts, men step from night, wearing kerchiefs more for dust than for drama, crew corralled with courtesy. Express car open with science less precise than desired. A blast too heavy, another. Money freed and men soot streaked like chimney sweeps after a holiday. Posse, always a posse. Whistles like geese, horses that know overtime. The bunch vanished into country that had signed non-disclosure agreements with sagebrush long before men invented such things on paper. Tipton later brought similar music. Then a switch to Banks, Winmucca, Nevada. A small town with a clean front room. Morning light. A teller who thought about fear and decided to be deliberate instead. Bags filled quickly. Doors used with minimal fuss. Horses clattering not because they were frightened but because the street pretended to be a creek and hooves liked to answer creaks with louder opinions. After Winmucca the air changed. Posters everywhere. Rewards tall enough to tilt men's ethics. Lawmen who were not scenery anymore but characters. Butch still smiled. He calmed hostages with asides. He thanked an engineer for not doing anything heroic and meant it. He returned a watch once, so says one man who told the story for whiskey and sincerity both. Wild bunch rotated safe houses, Brown's Park, Robbers Roost, hole in the wall. Cooks remembered their orders. Horses remembered their ties. Kids in remote ranches collected nicknames the way other children collect shells. but the rhythm of escape began to prefer waltz to sprint. Breakers rails had knit the country into one hearing. A delay in Utah made a deputy in Wyoming look up from his sandwich. Wanted notice in Colorado taught a shopkeeper in Texas how to spell Longaball before lunch. Somewhere in these miles, Butch and Sundance looked at each other across a table where Etta folded a map and said without saying it, "We have been everywhere here. Perhaps go where our names sound like foreign birds dot south." Etta's passport steamed to Buenos Aires and a ranch in the Indian quiet ocean air. Spanish learned the way Billy learned it, by kindness and proximity. Jalila's grass. A ranch that tried to be honest. Then new boys in town asking whether the past intended to stay packed. The steamer to South America left like a paragraph turning the page. Etta in a trim hat. Sundance composed. Butch delighted by small things, the patience of porters, the fact that a ship's rail can make a man philosophical. Buenos Aires offered boulevards that pretended every day was a holiday if you dressed correctly. They did their best. They ate ices on a bench like citizens. They took trains like respectable couples and pretended not to find it funny. South to Patagonia, Kalila, where green returns and mountains hold up the sky without bragging. They bought a ranch under tidy names. They built fences. They branded calves that were theirs by legal right. Neighbors remember them kindly, polite, competent, quick to help. For a while the cough of guns stayed out of the script. But men carry momentum the way saddlebags carry dust. News from the north arrived in envelopes stamped Pinkerton and in newspapers used for wrapping. Rumors sorted themselves around their names. Like swallows around eaves, a bank wagon in Santa Cruz province was robbed by riders whose manners reminded someone of someone, which might have been there or not. Stories prayed. Another payroll went light in the step wind. Etta looked at the horizon and saw a door closing. She returned north by some accounts, New York ship manifest whispering a name like hers, or she stayed longer and then vanished gently into the country's punctuation. However her story moves, we keep the respect due a woman who held the center politely among storms. Butch and Sundance drifted. They tried honest work in Chile and Bolivia. They tried their old craft when honesty would not pay for horses. The laughter stayed. The courtesies mostly did too. Bolivia's high country remembers the foreigners who were good with stock and careful with jokes. It also remembers soldiers who learned to listen for rails and rumors the way their northern counterparts had. San Vicente Rome, a crate of silver, and the echo that never quite stops a robbery at a mine. A village ring, shots in adobe, then versions, which we will speak softly, because bedtime prefers ambiguity handled with care. November 1908 by most calendars. Payroll near Santa Cruz, then a mine called San Vicente. To strangers, a mule with silver bars, commotion that made a small place suddenly feel like the center of a continent. Bolivian soldiers and police tighten a circle with more determination than practice. A lodging house, a shootout staccato grammar. Inside, Butch and Sundance did what they had always done. Talked first if talk would try, shot exact when talk would not. The night carried voices thin as wire, a lull, a decision no one outside heard. The shots closed together, silence that behaves like respect when it isn't sure what else to be. In the morning, bodies. Foreigners, spirited, wounds that matched a story many wanted to end because endings are tidy and newspapers are hungry. Burials recorded in town ledgers, a grave no one can agree on a century later. Other versions insist they lived, that Butch came north under another name, that Sundance limped into old age, in a place too small for reporters, that Etta kept a secret well enough to make it a virtue. For sleep we are allowed to hold both possibilities without injury. What matters is not whether a specific door closed in San Vicente, but what walked through American rooms for years before it. Butch Cassidy's insistence that cleverness is kinder than cruelty. Sundance's steadiness, Etta's poise. The Wild Bunch's lesson that fellowship can make even bad ideas look almost noble from the inside if you rain not careful. What do we keep? That laughter can be leadership. That rules broken with elegance are still broken. But the elegance teaches something about alternatives we wish had been chosen sooner. That posters simplify and people do not. From Butch's easy chair, if he had one, if he ever sat long enough, we can see the figure who rode. Beside him most often Harry Longaball, the Sundance Kid, quieter, straighter lines in his silhouette, eyes that count exits before a dealer has finished shuffling. He deserves his own long telling, not as an accessory but as a partner, a boy who learned winter in Pennsylvania, who took a sentence at Sundance, Wyoming, and carried the town's name like a scar that looked fashionable from a distance. We will meet him. Next 5 parts, same hush, same chronology, so your listeners can travel from Fort Worth to Patagonia and back again without waking. Morning in Georgia is soft around the edges, pine shade, red clay that remembers yesterday's rain, porch boards that groan like friendly dogs. John Henry Holliday first opened his eyes into that light August. 1851, Fayetteville by some almanacs, soon Griffin by memory's more comfortable chair, a father who had served and understood rules, mother who tuned rooms with kindness and a hymn. The boy learned scales before he learned